Chapter 1. The Warning. The silence in the Roosevelt room was broken only by the sound of paper sliding across mahogany. President Marcus Hayes stared at the polling data as if willing the numbers to change through sheer force of personality. They didn't. "Explain this to me again," Hayes said, his voice carrying that particular flatness that everyone in his inner circle had learned to dread. "Because what I'm seeing here doesn't make any goddamn sense." David Kessler, the campaign manager, shifted in his seat. At 42, he'd run 3 successful Senate campaigns and 1 presidential, and he'd never been afraid of delivering bad news. Until now. "Mr. President, these are aggregates from 17 independent polls conducted over the past 2 weeks. "Independent," Hayes interrupted, making air quotes with his fingers. "You mean biased?" "Sir, some of these are from organizations that supported you. They're all biased now." Hayes tossed the paper back across the table. "Every single one of them. They got to the polling companies. That's what's happening here." Victor Chen, the White House chief of staff, cleared his throat. Unlike Kessler, Chen had been with Hayes since the real estate days, had been the one who'd figured out how to navigate the transition from boardroom to Oval Office. He knew when to push and when to wait. This was a waiting moment. "Mr. President," Chen said carefully, "whether we agree with the methodology or not, these numbers represent what voters will be seeing in their news feeds. And with 21 days until the midterms, we need to be prepared for various scenarios." "Scenarios?" Hayes repeated. He stood abruptly, and the room seemed to shrink around his 6'3" frame. At 67, he still had the restless energy of a much younger man, all of it currently channeled into pacing. "You mean losing? We're looking at potentially losing 17 to 23 House seats," Kessler said, deciding to just rip off the bandage. "That puts the Democrats back in majority. Senate's tighter, but we could lose 2, maybe 3 seats. Best case, we hold a 51 to 49 margin." "Best case," Hayes said bitterly. He stopped pacing at the window, looking out over the south lawn. October in Washington. The leaves turning, the tourists still thick despite the cooling weather. All those people out there who thought they understood what he was trying to do for them, who'd elected him on promises he fully intended to keep, if only they'd give him the time and the tools. And worst case? The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. "Democrats take both chambers," Chen said, "which means the last 2 years of your first term." "I know what it means, Victor." Hayes turned from the window. "It means I become irrelevant. It means they'll impeach me for jaywalking if they get the chance. It means every executive order gets challenged, every appointment blocked, every policy initiative dead on arrival." "We can still campaign hard in the final 3 weeks," Kessler offered. "Hit the Rust Belt, do the rallies you're good at?" "I'm good at rallies because people love me," Hayes snapped. "But you're telling me that's not enough anymore." "The issue is turnout," Kessler said. "Our base is solid, but their base is energized. They're talking about this election as a referendum on democracy or some shit. Suburban voters we won last time are..." "Suburban voters," Hayes said the word like a curse. "Soccer moms who watch too much CNN and think I'm some kind of authoritarian because I want to actually enforce immigration law and stop the country from being invaded." Chen caught Kessler's eye and gave a tiny shake of his head. "Let it go." They tried logic, tried reason, tried every kind of presentation of the data. Hayes would accept it when he was ready to accept it, and not a moment before. That's how he'd always operated, in business and in politics. Reality was something you bent to your will, not something you accommodated. "What are our options?" Hayes asked, returning to his seat at the head of the table. He looked smaller now, older. The spray tan and the careful hair couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "And I mean real options, Victor. Not more consultants telling me to smile more for the cameras." Chen had been waiting for this question. He'd prepared for it with the kind of thoroughness he brought to everything. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, plain manila, Unremarkable, except for the single word written on the tab in Chen's precise handwriting. Continuity. There are constitutional mechanisms, Chen said slowly, for responding to national emergencies, powers that exist for situations where normal political processes might be insufficient to protect the country's interests. Kessler leaned forward. What kind of mechanisms? The Insurrection Act allows the president to deploy federal troops domestically under certain conditions. The National Emergencies Act grants broad authorities to redirect funding and resources. The Stafford Act for disasters. And there are others dating back to Lincoln. Lincoln, Hayes said, his eyes suddenly sharper. Who suspended habeas corpus? During the Civil War? Yes, sir. The precedent exists for extraordinary measures during extraordinary times. Victor, Kessler said slowly, we're talking about midterm elections, not a civil war. Are we? Chen opened the folder, revealing a stack of highlighted documents. How is it different if the country is being torn apart by forces that want to undo everything this president has accomplished? If election results are going to be determined by media companies spreading disinformation and tech giants suppressing conservative voices? If the very fabric of Jesus Christ, Kessler said, you're not seriously suggesting. I'm suggesting, Chen said coldly, that we explore all available options. That's my job. That's what the president pays me to do. Hayes held up a hand, silencing them both. He stared at the folder for a long moment. How legal is this? That depends on the circumstances, Mr. President. Emergency powers are broad, but they require an actual emergency. We'd need cause? And if we had cause? Then these authorities are perfectly constitutional. They've been invoked by presidents from both parties throughout history. The key is justification. So we need an emergency, Hayes said. We need to be prepared, Chen corrected carefully, to respond appropriately if an emergency arises. Kessler stood up abruptly. I need some air. Sit down, David, Hayes said, not looking at him. Victor, I want you to do a full workup on these authorities. Every option, every precedent, every legal justification. Something I can actually use, not theoretical bullshit. Mr. President, I really think we should focus on the campaign, Kessler began. The campaign is focus on the campaign, Hayes said. This is insurance. You ever run a business, David? Real business, not just political consulting? No, sir. Then let me tell you something about business. You always have insurance. You always have leverage. You always have a plan B, because assuming you're going to win is how you lose everything. He tapped the folder. This is Plan B. Chen closed the folder and placed it back in his briefcase. I'll have something for you in 72 hours, Mr. President. 48. Yes, sir. The meeting ended with the usual flurry of scheduling talk and logistics. Chen lingered as the others filed out, pretending to organize his papers while waiting for the room to clear. When they were alone, Hayes turned to him. You think I'm crazy? Hayes said. It wasn't a question. I think you're a president facing a difficult political situation, Chen replied. And I think you're right to explore all options. But these are powers that exist for genuine national emergencies, Mr. President. Using them for other purposes would be unprecedented. Lincoln did it. Lincoln faced an actual insurrection. States were seceding, there was a war. Hayes stood and walked to the portrait of Theodore Roosevelt that gave the room its name. You know what I see every day, Victor? I see a country tearing itself apart. I see foreign actors manipulating our elections through social media. I see domestic terrorists planning violence. I see a media establishment that's essentially operating as a propaganda arm for one party. How is that not a crisis? Those are concerning trends, sir, but they're not. And I see myself, Hayes continued, as possibly the only person who can hold this together, who can actually govern despite all the forces aligned against me, who can do what needs to be done. He turned to face Chen. Tell me, Victor, honestly, am I wrong? Chen met his gaze. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. He could walk out of this room, resign, maybe write a tell-all book, or he could stay, could help navigate the president through whatever came next, could remain at the center of power. No, sir, Chen heard himself say. You're not wrong. Good. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder with genuine warmth. Because I'm going to need you in the weeks ahead. I'm going to need someone I can trust absolutely. Always, Mr. President. Hayes returned to his seat and picked up another folder, this one stamped with the Department of Defense seal. I have a meeting with General Drummond in an hour. Military readiness briefing. Routine, but she likes to do them every quarter. General Drummond is thorough, Chen said carefully. Patricia Drummond, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was legendary for her by-the-book approach. She'd been appointed by the previous administration, but had maintained professional relationships across party lines. Smart, careful, and absolutely dedicated to the Constitution, which could be a problem. She's also a soldier, Hayes said. Soldiers follow orders. That's what they do. Within the bounds of, I know, lawful orders. That's why your homework is so important, Victor. Whatever we do, whenever we do it, has to be lawful, or at least legal enough that good people can justify following the orders. Chen felt something cold settle in his stomach. Mr. President, I should be clear that what I'm providing is a research document on theoretical powers. I'm not recommending. Of course not, Hayes said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're just doing your job, just like I'm doing mine. Just like General Drummond will do hers, when the time comes. He opened the DoD folder and began reviewing it, his signal that the conversation was over. Chen gathered his things and headed for the door. Victor, Hayes called after him. One more thing. Yes, sir? This folder, this conversation, the next one we'll have when you bring me your research. This all stays between us. Small circle. You understand? Absolutely, Mr. President. Because if word got out that we were even exploring these options, the media would have a field day. They'd twist it, make it sound like I'm planning some kind of coup. And that's not what this is. No, sir. This is a president being prepared to defend the Constitution and the country, whatever it takes, that's all. I understand, Mr. Bo. President, Chen left the Roosevelt room and walked through the West Wing's familiar corridors, nodding at staffers who had no idea what had just been discussed. His mind was already working through the research, the memos he'd need to pull, the legal authorities he'd need to brief. This is just contingency planning, he told himself. Every administration does contingency planning. This doesn't mean anything will actually happen. But as he reached his office and closed the door behind him, Chen found himself doing something he rarely did. He called his wife and told her he loved her, just in case. 3 hours later, General Patricia Drummond sat in the same seat Kessler had occupied and listened to President Hayes discuss military readiness with a kind of abstract curiosity that made her instincts twitch. She'd been doing these briefings for 8 years, through 2 administrations, and she'd learned to read the room. Today, the room felt wrong. And I'm particularly interested in rapid deployment capabilities, Hayes was saying. How quickly can we move significant forces domestically? Domestically, sir? Drummond kept her face neutral. For what purpose? Disaster response, civil unrest, that sort of thing? God forbid we have another Katrina situation. I want to know we can move fast. We have standing protocols for disaster response under the Stafford Act, Mr. President. Northcom coordinates with FEMA for. But theoretically, Hayes interrupted, If I ordered a full division deployed to, say, Michigan, how long would that take? Drummond's mind raced. Why Michigan? Why a full division? That was 15,000 troops. You didn't deploy that many people for disaster relief, you deployed that many people for war. Sir, that would depend on the purpose and legal authority. The Posse Comitatus Act limits the use of federal military and domestic law enforcement. We need, yes, I know about Posse Comitatus, but it has exceptions. The Insurrection Act, for instance. The Insurrection Act does provide exceptions, but it requires specific conditions. Actual insurrection, rebellion, or situations where state authorities are unable or unwilling to protect constitutional rights. She chose her next words carefully. It's not a general deployment authority. Hayes leaned back in his chair. But if those conditions existed, you could deploy. If those conditions existed and you invoked the act, yes, sir, the military would be obligated to follow lawful orders. She emphasized the word lawful, just slightly. Good to know. Hayes smiled, that famous smile that had charmed millions. Just trying to understand all my tools, General. Being prepared. Preparation is always wise, Mr. President. They talked for another 20 minutes about force readiness, equipment states, personnel issues. All routine. All professional. But when Drummond left the Oval Office, she found herself taking an unusual detour through the West Wing, past the Chief of Staff's office. The door was closed, but she could see Chen through the window, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, typing furiously on his laptop. General Drummond had served in combat zones, had made life-and-death decisions under fire, had stared down warlords and corrupt officials in a dozen countries. She'd learned to trust her instincts, the feeling in her gut that told her when something was wrong. That feeling was screaming now. She returned to the Pentagon and did something she'd never done in 30 years of service. She called her personal attorney and asked about document preservation requirements for military officers who might be asked to follow questionable orders. "Are you expecting to receive questionable orders, General?" her attorney asked. Drummond looked out her office window at the Potomac River, at the lights of Washington beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "Let's just say I believe in being prepared. Just like the President." Chapter 2. The Incident. The Cincinnati-Newport Bridge exploded at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 3rd, 5 days before the midterm elections. Elena Martinez was in her apartment in Arlington when her phone started screaming alerts. She'd been a Washington Post reporter for 7 years, covering everything from local corruption to international crises, but she'd never seen her phone light up like this. By 7:15, she was in the newsroom. By 8:00, she was on a conference call with the National Security Desk, trying to separate facts from speculation. The facts were grim. A major Ohio River crossing between Cincinnati and Kentucky had been destroyed by what preliminary reports suggested were multiple explosive devices. At least 14 people confirmed dead, dozens injured. First responders were still pulling cars from the water. The bridge had been a critical artery for commerce and commuter traffic, carrying 60,000 vehicles a day. The speculation was worse. Terrorism, foreign actors, domestic extremists. Everyone had a theory, and none of them were backed by evidence. "We're not publishing anything until we have confirmation," Elena's editor, Michael Torres, announced to the assembled reporters. "No speculation, no anonymous sources claiming responsibility unless we can verify. This is going to be the biggest story of the year, and we're going to get it right." But even as he spoke, Elena was watching CNN on the newsroom monitors. They were already running with Terror Attack in America graphics. Fox News was showing file footage of Middle Eastern militants. MSNBC was interviewing terrorism experts who admitted they knew nothing about who might be responsible. And in the White House, President Marcus Hayes was watching the same coverage and smiling. Victor Chen arrived at the Oval Office at 8:30 a.m. to find the president already at his desk, phone in hand, projecting an image of command that would play well for the cameras that would arrive shortly. "This is exactly what I've been warning about," Hayes said without preamble. This is what happens when we're seen as weak. When our enemies think they can attack us with impunity? Sir, we don't know who. I know enough. Hayes gestured at the television mounted on the wall. I know that American infrastructure has been attacked. I know that we have elections in 5 days, and I know that this country is looking to me to respond. Chen had barely slept since their meeting in the Roosevelt room. He'd spent 72 hours instead of 48 compiling his research, trying to find a way to present the emergency powers in a way that made them sound less dangerous. He'd failed. Mr. President, I have the research you requested. Good. Hayes muted the television. Walk me through it. Chen opened his briefcase, but Hayes held up a hand. Close the door first. Once they were sealed in, Chen spread out 3 memo documents on the resolute desk. The relevant authorities are surprisingly extensive. The National Emergencies Act of 1976 allows you to declare a national emergency based on your judgment of threats to national security or public safety. Once declared, it triggers approximately 150 statutory authorities across dozens of laws. And then? And then you have access to the Stafford Act for disaster response, which includes the ability to deploy federal resources. The Insurrection Act, which allows military deployment if you determine there's insurrection, domestic violence, or conspiracy that impedes normal law enforcement. Victor, I don't need the full legal history. Bottom line, can I postpone the elections? Chen felt his stomach twist. There it was, out in the open. Sir, the Constitution grants states the authority to conduct elections. The president doesn't have direct authority to postpone or cancel them. But in an emergency, you could deploy federal forces to assist in maintaining order. You could redirect federal resources. You might be able to argue that certain areas are unsafe for voting and recommend postponement. But constitutionally, those decisions would still rest with state authorities. And if state authorities refuse to act appropriately, if they were determined to hold elections despite clear security threats, then it's unclear. You could potentially invoke the Insurrection Act if you determined that states were failing to protect constitutional rights or maintain order. Once invoked, you'd have military authority to take necessary measures. But Mr. President, this is truly unprecedented territory. Hayes studied the memos, his finger tracing over the highlighted passages. Has any president ever done anything like this? Postponed elections? No, sir. Even during the Civil War, Lincoln held elections. But presidents have declared broad national emergencies, deployed troops domestically, and taken extraordinary measures. Wilson during World War I, Roosevelt during World War II, post-9/11 declarations. The powers exist. The precedent exists. The question is justification. And the bombing this morning? Chen had been dreading this question. Could potentially qualify, depending on who's responsible and whether there are credible threats of additional attacks. So we need more information. We need the intelligence community's assessment, sir. FBI, Homeland Security, the intelligence agencies. We need to know who did this and whether there's an ongoing threat. Hayes picked up his phone. Get me the FBI director. And the Secretary of Homeland Security. And Drummond. I want them all here in 1 hour. As Chen moved to leave, Hayes called after him. And Victor, prepare a draft declaration. National emergency with specific reference to election security. I may need it soon. Sir? Just a draft. Just in case. Chen nodded and left, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone to make the calls. Just a draft. Just in case. This was fine. This was normal. Presidents had to be prepared for contingencies. He didn't believe himself anymore. Senator Claire Middleton was in her Senate office when her chief of staff, Jonathan Park, burst in without knocking. Turn on the news. She'd been drafting a speech for a campaign event in Richmond, trying to figure out how to articulate her vision for a Senate that could actually function across party lines. The bombing footage made her forget all about bipartisanship. "My God," she whispered, watching the aerial shots of the collapsed bridge. "The rescue operations, the chaos. How many dead?" "At least 14 confirmed, maybe more." Claire had served as a federal prosecutor before running for Senate, had built cases against terrorists and organized criminals, had seen crime scene photos that still gave her nightmares. But there was something about seeing mass casualties unfold in real time that made it worse somehow. These people had been driving to work, taking their kids to school, living their lives, and then suddenly they weren't. "Statement?" Jonathan asked. "Give me 10 minutes." She needed to process this, needed to think through what it meant beyond the immediate tragedy. 5 days before a critical election. In Ohio, a key swing state. The timing was, no, don't go there. Not yet. People were dead. That was what mattered now. She spent 20 minutes drafting a statement expressing condolences, calling for unity, praising first responders. The standard crisis response, but she meant every word. By the time she finished, her television was showing President Hayes emerging from the White House to address the press corps. Hayes looked appropriately somber, standing at the outdoor podium with the White House facade behind him. "My fellow Americans, this morning our nation was attacked. Infrastructure that serves hundreds of thousands of Americans was deliberately destroyed by forces who wish to undermine our way of life and disrupt our democratic processes." Claire sat up straighter. He was already calling it an attack on democracy? They didn't even know who was responsible yet. "I have directed the full resources of the federal government to identify and bring to justice those responsible for this heinous act. But I have also taken steps to ensure that this tragedy does not prevent American citizens from safely exercising their constitutional right to vote. Effective immediately, I am declaring a national emergency under the National Emergencies Act. I am deploying federal law enforcement and, if necessary, military assets to ensure the security of our election infrastructure in affected areas." "Jesus," Jonathan breathed. "He's deploying troops?" "With elections in 5 days," Claire said slowly. "In swing states," Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger. "I want to be clear. These measures are not political. They are not partisan. They are about protecting American lives and preserving our democratic institutions. No terrorist, foreign or domestic, will prevent this country from conducting free and fair elections. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless America." He walked away without taking questions, leaving the press corps shouting after him. Claire's phone started ringing immediately. Other senators, reporters, staff members, all wanting to know what she thought about the president's statement. She ignored them all and called one person, Stanford law professor Andrew Wilkinson, a constitutional scholar who'd written extensively on executive power. "Tell me I'm crazy," she said when he answered. "And about what?" "About thinking that deploying federal troops 5 days before an election might be a terrible idea with horrifying implications." Wilkinson was quiet for a moment. "You're not crazy. But you need to be careful how you phrase this, Claire. People are scared. They want protection. If you immediately start attacking the president's response, you'll sound like you're more concerned about politics than about American lives. I am concerned about American lives. I'm concerned about the precedent of federal military forces being deployed to protect elections. You know the history as well as I do. Every tyrant in history has used security threats as justification for other giant with. I know. And you're right to be worried. But right now, the president has given himself plausible deniability. He's responding to a crisis. Until we know more about who's responsible and whether there are credible ongoing threats, you can question his approach, but you can't claim he's acting unconstitutionally. Not yet. Claire looked at her television, which was now showing military convoys moving through Ohio. So what do I do? You watch very carefully. You document everything. You build your case. And if he oversteps, when he oversteps, you'll be ready. When, not if. Thanks, Andrew. She hung up and called her press secretary. Schedule a press conference for this afternoon. I want to express support for security measures, but also emphasize the importance of preserving normal democratic processes. And Jonathan? She turned to her chief of staff. Start reaching out to other senators. Quietly. I want to know who's uncomfortable with this and who might be willing to push back if things go too far. Define too far. Claire watched the military convoys on her screen. I'll know it when I see it. Elena Martinez spent the day on the phone, tracking down sources, cross-referencing reports, trying to build a clear picture of what had actually happened in Cincinnati. By evening, she had more questions than answers. The bombing was sophisticated. Multiple coordinated explosions at structural weak points. Professional work, not the kind of thing amateur terrorists could pull off. That was fact. But the rest was troubling. She'd found a structural engineer willing to speak on background who'd examined the footage. Those weren't random placements, the engineer told her. Someone knew exactly where to hit to bring the entire structure down. That requires access, planning, expertise. Foreign Intelligence Service? Elena asked. Maybe. But it also requires detailed knowledge of the specific bridge's construction, including modifications made during renovations 3 years ago. That information isn't readily available unless you had inside access. Elena made a note. Inside access. She'd come back to that. She'd also talked to 3 FBI sources, all anonymous, all nervous about talking. 2 claimed the Bureau was under enormous pressure from the White House to reach conclusions quickly. The 3rd had said something that made Elena's journalist instincts tingle. We're getting a lot of guidance from above about what theories to pursue and which ones to consider unlikely. What theories are you being told to consider unlikely, she'd asked. Can't say. But let's just say the direction of the investigation seems to have been decided before the investigation really started. She was writing up her notes when her editor called her into his office. How solid is your reporting on the investigation? Solid enough to raise questions, not solid enough to make accusations. Torres nodded. We're going with a front-page story tomorrow. Investigation into bridge bombing raises questions. Can you have 1,500 words by midnight? I can have 3,000 words, but most of it would be speculation and innuendo. Then give me 1,500 words of facts and documented concerns. We lead with the tragedy, but we note that questions are emerging about the investigation's direction. Attribute everything. No anonymous sources unless you can describe them with enough detail to establish credibility. Elena spent the next 6 hours writing, rewriting, checking facts, and cutting anything that couldn't be nailed down with multiple sources. By midnight, she had her story. By 1 a.m., it was edited and posted online. By 2 a.m., she was asleep. By 8 a.m., President Hayes would declare it fake news and threaten to revoke the Washington Post's White House credentials. By noon, he would go much further. Chen was in the Oval Office when Hayes read the Post story on his phone. The president's face went from pale to red in the space of 3 seconds. This is a lie, Hayes said, his voice tight with fury. This is the media trying to undermine our response to a terrorist attack. This is treasonous. Sir, it's a news story it's propaganda. Hayes threw his phone onto the desk. I want the Post's credentials revoked. I want the Justice Department to investigate who leaked classified information about the investigation. Mr. President. Chen kept his voice calm, professional. We need to be strategic here. If we overreact, we make the story bigger. We make it about press freedom instead of about terrorism. Hayes took a deep breath, visibly wrestling with his temper. Fine. Then we need to control the narrative. What's the status on the emergency declaration? Signed and ready to implement. But sir, I need to advise you again about the optics of. The optics are that I'm protecting American elections. That's it. Get me the Secretary of Homeland Security. And Drummond. I want troop deployments finalized today. Where specifically, sir? Hayes pulled up a map on his computer screen, one that showed congressional districts colored red and blue. Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona. All the places where we're in competitive races. All the places where this bombing shows we need federal protection. Sir, those are all swing states. The perception will be what we make it. We're protecting America. If Democrats want to complain about that, let them. Let them explain why they don't want federal troops protecting polling places from terrorists. Chen stared at the map. He was looking at federal troops being deployed to every battleground state in the country. In the final days before an election the president was projected to lose. It was brilliant politically and absolutely catastrophic constitutionally. Draft the deployment orders, Hayes said. I'll sign them this afternoon. Yes, sir. As Chen left the Oval Office, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. Are you okay? I'm seeing troop movements on the news. This seems extreme. He looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Everything's fine, just busy. Love you. The lies were getting easier. General Drummond received her deployment orders at 3 p.m. She read them 3 times, hoping she'd misunderstood. She hadn't. The president was invoking the Insurrection Act, claiming that state and local authorities were unable or unwilling to protect federal election infrastructure from credible terrorist threats. He was ordering the deployment of 25,000 federal troops to 5 states, with authority to take all necessary measures to ensure election security. All necessary measures. That phrase would haunt her. She immediately called a meeting with the Joint Chiefs. The Secretary of Defense attended via secure video conference. Is this legal? The Navy's Chief of Naval Operations asked. It's within the President's authority under the Insurrection Act, Drummond said carefully. Whether it's appropriate or wise is another question. The mission seems pretty clear, the Army Chief of Staff said. Provide security at polling places, prevent interference with voting. That's not combat operations. That's just presence. And if state authorities object? Drummond asked. If governors say they don't need or want federal troops? If there are confrontations between federal forces and local law enforcement? Silence. These are lawful orders, the Secretary of Defense said finally. We execute them professionally and appropriately. We don't make policy, we implement it. Even if the policy is to deploy federal troops to swing states 5 days before an election? Drummond couldn't keep the edge out of her voice. General, the SecDef said coldly, your personal political opinions are not relevant. The President has invoked legitimate constitutional authority. We will execute his orders. Is that understood? Yes, sir. After the meeting ended, Drummond sat alone in her office for a long time. She'd sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not the President. But the President was the Commander-in-Chief, and unless orders were clearly unlawful, she was obligated to follow them. These orders weren't clearly unlawful. They were troubling, potentially disastrous, but not clearly unlawful. Not yet. She picked up her secure phone and began making calls to unit commanders, issuing the deployment orders, knowing that every word she spoke was taking the country one step closer to a precipice she could see but not stop. By 10 p.m. that night, President Hayes went on television again. This time, he made a longer address from the Oval Office, the setting designed to convey both gravity and comfort. My fellow Americans, this has been a difficult day for our nation. But I want you to know that your government is working around the clock to keep you safe and to preserve your right to participate in free and fair elections. After extensive consultations with my security team, and based on intelligence that I cannot share publicly without compromising ongoing investigations, I have made a difficult decision. In coordination with state authorities in Ohio, Kentucky, and several other states, where credible threats have been identified, I am recommending the temporary postponement of elections in specific precincts that cannot be adequately secured in the next 5 days. Let me be clear, this is not a cancellation. This is not about politics. This is about ensuring that when Americans vote, they can do so safely, without fear of terrorist attack or intimidation. The affected areas will hold their elections once proper security measures are in place, likely within 2 weeks. I know some will criticize this decision, but I have a responsibility that transcends politics. I have a duty to protect American lives and preserve our democratic institutions. I will not apologize for taking that duty seriously. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. As the address ended, Claire Middleton was already on her phone with constitutional scholars, civil rights attorneys, and fellow senators. Senator Mike Thompson from Ohio was screaming into his phone about federal overreach. Senator Rachel Kim from Michigan was demanding emergency Senate session. Elena Martinez was furiously typing notes for a follow-up story about which precincts were affected and what they had in common politically. Victor Chen was in his office, staring at deployment maps, wondering how he'd gone from helping run a company to helping plan what looked increasingly like a coup. And General Drummond was calling her attorney again, this time to ask about the process for military officers who refuse unlawful orders and the protections they might have. The bridge in Cincinnati was still smoking. The bodies were still being pulled from the river. The investigation was still ongoing. But the crisis was just beginning. Chapter 3, The Resistance. Governor Sarah Chen of Michigan, no relation to Victor, was in her office at 6 a.m. on November 4th when the federal marshals arrived. She'd been expecting them since the president's address the night before. Governor Chen, the lead marshal said, showing his credentials, "I'm here to serve you with a federal order requiring compliance with the president's election security directives." Sarah took the document and read it carefully. She'd been a civil rights attorney before entering politics, had argued cases before federal courts, knew exactly what she was looking at. "This order requires me to postpone elections in 17 precincts in Michigan." "That's correct, ma'am. Precincts that went 73% Democratic in the last election." The marshal's face remained neutral. "I'm just serving the order, Governor. The order is unconstitutional. Election administration is a state function. The president has no authority to mandate postponement." "Ma'am, that's a question for the courts. My job is to ensure compliance with federal authority." Sarah set the document down and looked the marshal in the eye. "Then you have a problem, because I'm not complying. Michigan will hold elections on November 8th as scheduled, in all precincts, including the 17 the president wants suspended. If the president believes that's unsafe, he's welcome to deploy his troops to provide security. But he will not prevent my citizens from voting. Governor, I need to advise you that refusing to comply with this order could result in federal charges." "Then charge me. I'll see you in court." The marshal looked pained. "Ma'am, I really don't want this to escalate. Neither do I. But I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I'm going to keep it. Are we done here?" The marshal nodded slowly and left. Sarah immediately called her attorney general and her state police commander. "It's happening. Activate our legal response plan and prepare for federal interference with state law enforcement." By noon, 4 other governors had issued similar statements. By 3 p.m., federal marshals were attempting to physically prevent state election officials from accessing ballot storage facilities. By 6 p.m., there were standoffs in 3 states between federal agents and state police. And in Washington, Senator Claire Middleton was organizing the resistance. The Senate had technically been in recess for campaign season, but Claire managed to get 37 senators back to Washington for an emergency caucus. They met in a secure conference room, away from cameras and reporters. "The president has crossed a line," Claire began without preamble. "He's using a dubious interpretation of emergency powers to interfere with elections in a way that clearly benefits his party. He's deploying military forces to swing states. He's threatening state officials who refuse to comply. This is not about security. This is about power." Senator Mike Thompson from Ohio stood. "My state just had a major infrastructure attack. My constituents are dead. The president is trying to protect. To protect what, Mike?" Claire interrupted her. "Think about which precincts he's postponing. They're all Democratic strongholds. Every single one. If this were really about security, the postponements would be based on proximity to the attack, on credible threat assessments. Instead, they're based on voting patterns." "That's speculation," Senator James Crawford from Texas said. Crawford was Hayes's most reliable defender in the Senate. "The president has access to intelligence we don't. Maybe those precincts are targets. Then let him share that intelligence," Claire shot back. "Let him brief the full intelligence committees. Let him show us the specific, credible threats that justify this unprecedented action. Because right now, all we have is his word. And frankly, his word isn't good enough when we're talking about suspending elections." Senator Rachel Kim from Michigan spoke up. "My governor is refusing to comply. Federal marshals are attempting to seize ballot materials. We're hours away from physical confrontations between federal and state law enforcement. This is going to turn violent unless we intervene." "What do you propose?" someone asked. Claire took a breath. This was the moment. "I propose we begin impeachment proceedings." Immediately, the room exploded in overlapping voices. Claire raised her hand for silence. "I know what I'm saying. I know the timing is terrible. But the Constitution gives Congress the power to check presidential overreach, and we have to use it. If we don't, if we just sit back and let this happen, we're complicit." "The House would have to initiate impeachment," Senator Thompson pointed out, "and they're not in session." "Speaker Rodriguez is already organizing House members for an emergency session," Claire said. "She's waiting for the Senate to show we'll actually convict before she moves forward." "We need to show her we will." "On what charges?" Crawford demanded. "Abuse of power, obstruction of justice, attempting to manipulate federal elections. Take your pick. We have grounds." The argument went on for 2 more hours. By the end, Claire had commitments from 43 senators to support impeachment if the House moved forward. Not enough to convict. They'd need 67 for that. But enough to make it real. Enough to send a message. "This is going to tear the country apart," Senator Thompson said quietly as they prepared to leave. "The country is already being torn apart," Claire replied. "We're just trying to hold it together." General Patricia Drummond received the order at 1900 hours. "Use military force to secure ballot facilities in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Arrest state officials who interfere. Prevent elections in designated precincts by any means necessary." She read the order 3 times, then called her JAG, Judge Advocate General, the military's top lawyer. "Is this lawful?" she asked. Captain Elizabeth Morrison had been a military attorney for 15 years. She read the order carefully. "It's complicated, General. The President has invoked the Insurrection Act, which gives him broad authority to use military force domestically if he determines that rebellion or conspiracy prevents normal law enforcement. If state officials are actively defying federal authority, that could theoretically qualify. But we're talking about using military force to prevent elections. We're talking about using military force to enforce a presidential order regarding election security," Morrison corrected carefully. The distinction matters legally. Does it matter constitutionally? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. General, my job is to advise you on military law. But if you're asking my personal opinion, no, I don't think the distinction matters. I think this is an unconstitutional use of military force, and I think the president is using the Insurrection Act as a pretext to interfere with elections. Can I refuse the order? You can. But you'd be relieved of command immediately and probably court-martialed. The president has very broad authority over the military, and unless an order is clearly unlawful, which this isn't, legally speaking, you're obligated to follow it or resign. Drummond stared at the order. What would you do? I'd document everything. I'd ensure every order I gave to subordinates was in writing and clearly attributed to the president. I'd make sure there's a record of my objections and concerns. And then I'd follow the order, because the alternative is abandoning my post at a critical moment and leaving the military in the hands of someone who might be more willing to escalate. That sounds like rationalization. Maybe. But it's also strategic. If this ends up in court, when this ends up in court, the record will matter. And having someone like you in the chain of command, someone who's following orders under protest but maintaining professional standards, might be the difference between military units acting professionally and military units acting like occupying forces. Drummond nodded slowly. Issue the deployment orders. But I want every unit commander briefed that their primary mission is to avoid confrontation with state authorities if possible. De-escalation is the priority. No one fires unless fired upon. And even then, only with my direct authorization. Is that clear? Yes, General. After Morrison left, Drummond did something she'd never done in 30 years. She called a journalist. Not directly. She used a trusted intermediary to reach Elena Martinez at the Washington Post. The message was simple. A senior military officer wants to provide background on the deployment orders. Deep background, not for attribution. Interested? Elena's response came back within minutes. Absolutely. Victor Chen was having a nervous breakdown in slow motion. He'd spent the past 48 hours drafting orders, coordinating with federal agencies, managing the logistics of what was rapidly becoming a domestic military operation. He'd done everything the president asked, done it efficiently and professionally, because that's what he did. That's who he was. But now he was sitting in his office at 11 p.m., surrounded by documents that detailed the systematic undermining of American democracy, and he couldn't pretend anymore. His phone buzzed. His wife again. Victor, I'm scared. What's happening? People at work are talking about impeachment, about military coups. Please tell me you're okay. He stared at the message. What could he tell her? That he was fine? That this was normal? That her husband was actively helping implement orders that might result in the overthrow of constitutional governance? Instead of responding, he opened his laptop and created a new folder, buried deep in his file system, encrypted with a password only he knew. Then he began copying documents, deployment orders, legal memos, internal communications, recordings of meetings, everything. He didn't have a plan for what he'd do with this documentation. He just knew he needed to preserve it. Needed some record of what was happening. Needed proof that he'd tried what? He hadn't tried anything. He'd followed orders. He'd enabled this. His office door opened without warning. President Hayes stood there, flanked by 2 Secret Service agents. Walk with me, Victor. Chen quickly closed his laptop and followed the president through the West Wing's empty corridors, out into the colonnade that connected to the residence. The night was cold, and Chen hadn't grabbed his coat. I'm hearing disturbing reports, Hayes said as they walked. Reports that some senators are talking about impeachment, that governors are refusing lawful orders, that even some military commanders are questioning their missions. Yes, sir. The situation is fluid. Hayes stopped and turned to face him. I need to know you're with me, Victor. Absolutely, completely with me. Because what we're doing here, it's going to get harder before it gets easier. There are going to be moments where we have to make very difficult decisions, and I need my inner circle to be solid. I'm with you, Mr. President. Are you? Hayes's eyes were cold. Because sometimes I wonder. Sometimes I see hesitation, doubt. Sir, I serve at your pleasure. I've done everything you've asked. Doing what I ask and believing in what I ask are different things. Hayes resumed walking. Let me tell you something about leadership, Victor. Real leadership isn't about consensus. It's not about making everyone comfortable. It's about having the courage to do what's necessary, even when it's unpopular, even when it's hard. Lincoln understood that. He suspended habeas corpus, arrested newspaper editors, held elections at gunpoint. And you know what? History remembers him as our greatest president. Lincoln faced an actual civil war. And I faced the slow-motion destruction of everything that makes this country great. It's just a different kind of war. They reached the residence entrance. Hayes put a hand on Chen's shoulder. I'm going to need you in the days ahead. I'm going to need you to be strong, to be loyal, to help me see this through. Can you do that? Chen felt himself nod. Yes, sir. Good. Hayes smiled, the famous smile. Get some rest, Victor. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Chen walked back to his office, retrieved his laptop, and drove home. His wife was asleep when he arrived. He sat at their kitchen table, opened his encrypted folder, and continued copying documents until 4 a.m. He was with the president. He was also building the case against him. That cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Elena Martinez met her military source in a parking garage in Arlington at 2 a.m. Very Watergate, very cliché, but the source had insisted on extreme security measures. The figure approached from the shadows. A woman in civilian clothes, early 60s, carrying herself with military bearing even in jeans and a jacket. I can't tell you who I am, the woman said. But I'm senior enough to know what's being ordered and why. And someone needs to tell the truth. Elena had her notebook out. I'm listening. The deployment orders are tactically sound but strategically catastrophic. We're being ordered to secure ballot facilities in 17 specific precincts across 5 states. Every single one of those precincts is a Democratic stronghold. Every single one. If this were really about security, the deployment would be based on proximity to threats, on infrastructure vulnerability, on population density. Instead, it's based on voting patterns. Can you prove that? I can't give you documents without ending my career and possibly going to prison. But I can tell you where to look. There's a memo from the White House Chief of Staff to the Department of Homeland Security dated November 2nd, the day before the bombing. It references security concerns in key electoral districts and lists the exact precincts that are now subject to postponement. November 2nd, before the bombing. Elena stopped writing. You're saying they knew? I'm saying the memo exists. You interpret what that means. But here's what I know for certain. The deployment orders I'm executing are designed to prevent specific populations from voting, not to protect them, to prevent them. And that's not what I swore an oath to do. Why are you telling me this? The woman looked at her with tired eyes. Because I can't stop it from the inside. Because refusing orders means I get relieved and someone more willing takes my place. Because maybe if the American people know the truth, they'll stop it. That's probably naive, but it's all I've got. What happens if the governors keep resisting? Then people are going to die. We have units deployed who are scared, confused, and being given conflicting guidance. We have state police who see federal troops as occupiers. We have armed federal agents at ballot facilities facing armed state troopers. It's going to turn violent. It's just a question of when. When do you think? Hours. Maybe a day. Someone's going to panic, someone's going to shoot, and then all hell breaks loose. The woman melted back into the shadows. Elena stood in the parking garage for a long moment, processing what she'd just heard, then drove straight to the newsroom to write the story of her career that the shooting started in Grand Rapids, Michigan at 7:23 a.m. on November 7th. A federal team attempting to remove ballot boxes from a county election office found themselves blocked by Michigan State Police, acting on orders from Governor Chen. What happened next would be disputed in the investigations that followed, but the facts were these. Someone drew a weapon. Someone else fired. Within 30 seconds, 7 shots had been exchanged. When it was over, a federal marshal was dead, 2 state troopers were wounded, and the United States had crossed into territory it hadn't seen since the Civil War. American government forces shooting at each other. President Hayes was in the Oval Office when he got the news. Victor Chen watched the color drain from his face, watched him age 10 years in 10 seconds. "Get me Drummond," Hayes said quietly, "and the Attorney General, and activate the National Guard in Michigan. Federal authority." "Sir, that will be seen as an escalation." "They fired on federal agents." Hayes' voice rose. "They killed a federal marshal. What am I supposed to do, Victor? Let states shoot at federal officers with impunity. We don't know who fired first. I don't care who fired first. This is insurrection, actual insurrection, and I'm going to put it down. Get me Drummond. Now." As Chen left to make the call, he pulled out his phone and added another entry to his encrypted documentation. "President orders National Guard activation in response to Grand Rapids shooting. No investigation completed. No confirmation of state culpability. Escalation appears to be goal, not response." He was documenting the constitutional crisis he was helping create that the moral weight was crushing. In the Senate, Claire Middleton called an emergency session. 47 senators assembled, with more joining by secure video link. "A federal marshal is dead," Claire began. "State officers are wounded. The president is federalizing the Michigan National Guard. We are hours away from American soldiers fighting American police in American streets. This has to stop. Now." "What do you propose?" Senator Kim asked. "I propose we pass a resolution, with force of law, requiring the president to withdraw federal forces from all 5 states, to rescind the election postponement orders, and to allow states to conduct elections as scheduled under state authority. I propose we make it clear that if he refuses, we will impeach and convict." "You don't have the votes to convict," Crawford said. "I have 43 committed votes. I need 24 more. And after today, after an American has died because of this president's orders, I think I can find them. The question is whether you want to be on the right side of history or whether you want to be remembered as the people who stood by while democracy died." The debate raged for 4 hours. By evening, Claire had her resolution drafted and 51 votes committed. Not enough to convict on impeachment, but enough to make a statement, enough to show that the Senate would act. Resolution passed at 11 p.m., 51-49. President Hayes' response came at midnight. "The Senate resolution is non-binding and unconstitutional. I will not comply. My oath is to protect the Constitution, even from those who claim to defend it." The point of no return had passed. General Drummond was in the Pentagon's Operations Center when the Michigan National Guard came under federal control. She'd been on the phone with the Guard's commander, Major General Robert Martinez, trying to convince him to stand down. "General, my oath is to the governor of Michigan and to the Constitution," Martinez had said. "The president's orders are unconstitutional, and I will not execute them." General Martinez, you're being placed under federal authority. You no longer answer to the governor. With respect, General Drummond, I answer to my oath. And my oath doesn't require me to follow unconstitutional orders, even from the President of the United States. The line had gone dead. Drummond now faced a situation unprecedented in modern American history. A state National Guard unit in effective rebellion against federal authority, federal troops ordered to enforce election postponements against state opposition, and a president demanding she resolve the situation. She'd spent 30 years preparing for war, but never this war. Never against her own countrymen. Her phone rang. It was Elena Martinez, intermediary. The general wants to set up another meeting. Tomorrow night. She has more information. Tell her yes, Drummond said, because if she couldn't stop this from the inside, maybe she could at least help someone document it for history, and for the courts that would eventually have to sort through the wreckage. Chapter 4. The Rubicon. November 8th dawned on a country that no longer recognized itself. In 37 states, voting proceeded normally. Poll workers showed up. Voters cast ballots. Democracy functioned as it had for nearly 2.5 centuries. But in 5 states, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, the day was chaos. In some precincts, polls opened under the watchful presence of federal troops. In others, state officials had removed ballot boxes overnight, hiding them in warehouses and school gymnasiums, conducting ad hoc voting away from federal oversight. In still others, polling places remained locked, federal marshals standing guard, while state police stood across the street, neither side willing to back down but both terrified of starting another shootout. And in Washington, President Marcus Hayes watched the coverage with grim satisfaction. Turnout is down 30% in the contested areas, Victor Chen reported, reading from his tablet. Most voters are too scared to show up with armed troops at polling places. Good, Hayes said. Fear keeps people safe. Fear keeps them from making mistakes. Chen looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time what he'd been helping create. This wasn't about security. This had never been about security. It was about power, pure and simple. And Chen had spent the last week providing the legal justification and logistical support. Sir, the Supreme Court has announced they're convening an emergency session tomorrow. Multiple states have filed suit challenging your authority. Hayes waved a hand dismissively. Let them. By the time they rule, the election will be over and we'll have maintained order. What are they going to do? Reverse reality. They could rule that your actions were unconstitutional. They could order the restoration of normal voting procedures. They could. They could do a lot of things, Hayes interrupted, but they won't. Because Thomas Brennan is too careful, too concerned about the court's legitimacy. He'll write some narrow ruling that technically goes against me but doesn't actually require any real action. That's how he operates. Chen wasn't so sure. Chief Justice Thomas Brennan had a reputation for moderation, yes, but also for fierce defense of judicial independence. And Hayes had just spent a week treating the judiciary as irrelevant. I think you might be underestimating him, sir. Hayes turned to look at him, and Chen saw something in the president's eyes that made him deeply uncomfortable. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, I need you focused on the next phase. Next phase? The results are going to be contested. The Democrats are going to claim the election was invalid because of the postponements. They're going to refuse to accept the results, refuse to recognize the new Congress. That's insurrection, Victor. That's the very thing the Insurrection Act was designed to address. Sir, if they're challenging results through legal channels take time. And in that time, the country will be paralyzed. We can't afford that. We need continuity of government. Hayes pulled out a folder, a new one, not the continuity folder from their first meeting, but something that looked even more ominous. I need you to draft orders for the arrest of congressional leaders who refuse to accept legitimate election results, sedition charges. Chen felt his world tilt. Mr. President, you can't arrest members of Congress for political opposition. I can arrest anyone who's attempting to overthrow the government. That's not political opposition. That's treason. Sir, this is exactly what the founders feared. This is exactly why they built in checks and balances. The founders also understood that sometimes extraordinary measures are necessary. They gave us the tools. They gave us emergency powers, military authority, the ability to defend the nation from all enemies, foreign and domestic. I'm just using those tools. Chen stood, something he rarely did when the president was seated. Sir, I can't do this. I can help you arrest senators for doing their constitutional duty. Hayes stood as well, his face hardening. Then you're relieved of your duties as chief of staff, effective immediately. Clean out your office. Security will escort you out. Yes, sir. Chen felt oddly relieved. He was out. He was done enabling this. He could go home. Could tell his wife he'd finally found his line. Could. And Victor? You're going to need a lawyer. Because anyone who walks away from this administration right now is going to be viewed as a potential threat to national security. Your communications will be monitored. Your movements will be tracked. And if you say one word to the press, to Congress, to anyone about what you know, I'll have you arrested for violating your security clearances. Are we clear? Chen felt the trap close around him.
Crystal clear, Mr.
President. He walked out of the Oval Office for the last time, escorted by Secret Service agents who'd gone from protecting him to guarding him. They allowed him to pack a box of personal items from his office, carefully checking each item, and then drove him home. His wife met him at the door. Victor? What happened? I quit, he said. Then? No, I was fired for refusing an order. She hugged him, and he felt her trembling. Or maybe he was trembling. What do we do now? Now, Chen said quietly, I call Senator Claire Middleton and tell her everything I know. Senator Middleton was in her office when her secure line rang. Senator Middleton? Senator, this is Victor Chen. Until about an hour ago, I was the White House Chief of Staff. I need to talk to you. Urgently. Claire's pulse quickened. Are you in danger? Probably. But that's not why I'm calling. I have documentation. Lots of it. Internal memos, recordings, orders, everything. I've been keeping records since this started. And I think you need to see them before the president makes his next move. Which is arresting congressional leaders on sedition charges. He's already drafting the orders. It's happening in the next 48 hours. Claire felt her blood run cold. Can you prove that? I can prove everything. But we need to move fast. The president has me under surveillance. I'm being monitored. If I try to leave my house, I'll be detained. Where are you now? Home. In Alexandria. Claire thought quickly. I'm sending my chief of staff to you. His name is Jonathan Park. He'll be there in 30 minutes. Give him everything. We'll keep you safe. Senator, I don't care about safe. I care about stopping this. Use whatever I give you. End this. The line went dead. Claire immediately called Jonathan. Code red. I need you to go to an address I'm about to text you. You're picking up the most important package of your career. Take 2 Senate security officers. If anyone tries to stop you, you invoke congressional immunity, and you call me immediately. What kind of package? The kind that might save the country. Move. Chief Justice Thomas Brennan was in his Supreme Court office, surrounded by law clerks and constitutional scholars, preparing for the most important session of his career. At 62, he'd been on the court for 8 years, Chief Justice for 3. He'd always tried to avoid the appearance of partisanship, had always positioned the court above politics. That time was over. The constitutional issues are clear. he said to his assembled advisers. The president has no authority to postpone elections. None. States administer elections under the Constitution. The president can declare emergencies, can deploy troops, but he cannot prevent states from conducting elections. The government will argue necessity, one clerk pointed out. Security concerns, terrorist threats. Then they need to prove those concerns are legitimate and not pretextual. And from what we're seeing, the pattern of which precincts were targeted strongly suggests political motivation, not security concerns. Justice Sarah Chen, coincidentally sharing a surname with both the Michigan governor and the former White House chief of staff, spoke up via video link from her secure location. Tom, we need to be prepared for the possibility that the president simply ignores our ruling. Then we'll have a full-blown constitutional crisis, Brennan said. But that's a risk we have to take. The court exists for moments like this. If we don't act, we're complicit in the destruction of constitutional governance. And if he arrests us? Justice Chen asked quietly. The room fell silent. It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no one had wanted to voice. Could an American president actually arrest Supreme Court justices? Lincoln arrested judges, someone said. Lincoln faced an actual civil war, Brennan replied. We're facing an election dispute. It's not the same. Isn't it? Justice Chen leaned forward. Tom, I've been reading the intelligence reports that are circulating. The shooting in Grand Rapids, the standoffs, the governor's under arrest warrants. This looks an awful lot like the early stages of civil conflict. And if the president believes he's facing insurrection, or if he can convince enough people he is, then arresting judges who oppose him might seem justified to him. Brennan stood and walked to his window, looking out at the Supreme Court plaza. Then we need to move quickly. We hear arguments tomorrow, we rule by the end of the day. We don't give him time to preempt us. Oral arguments in constitutional cases usually take weeks to schedule. These aren't usual times. I'm invoking the court's emergency docket authority. We hear this tomorrow at 10 a.m. All parties will have notice, and we will rule immediately thereafter. If the president wants to arrest us, he'll have to do it after we've spoken. Elena Martinez's story hit the Washington Post's website at 6 p.m. on November 8th. The headline was devastating. Documents suggest bridge bombing may have been anticipated by White House. The story detailed the memo from Victor Chen to DHS, dated November 2nd, identifying security concerns in key electoral districts that matched exactly the precincts, later subject to postponement. It included testimony from structural engineers suggesting the bombing required inside knowledge of the bridge's construction. It noted that the investigation had been suspiciously quick to rule out certain possibilities, while emphasizing others. That just stopped short of accusing the administration of orchestrating the bombing. Elena didn't have proof of that, but it raised enough questions to be explosive. That story went viral within minutes. Cable news picked it up immediately. Social media erupted. And in the White House, President Hayes watched his careful narrative crumble. Who leaked this? He demanded, reading from his phone. His new acting chief of staff, Derek Morrison, promoted from deputy chief after Chen's departure, looked terrified. Sir, we're investigating. But the document she references is real. I know it's real. I authorized it. But it was classified. Someone leaked classified information to the press, and I want them found. Sir, with respect, the bigger problem is the content. If the public believes we had foreknowledge of the bombing, we didn't have foreknowledge. Hayes threw his phone across the room. We had contingency planning. We identified potential vulnerabilities. That's what responsible governments do. I understand that, sir, but the optics. Fuck the optics. Hayes was pacing now, his face flushed. I'm trying to save this country. and all anyone cares about is optics. Well, here are the optics. Tomorrow, the Supreme Court is going to rule against me. They're going to try to strip away my authority to maintain order. They're going to side with insurrectionists and call it constitutional law. What do you want to do, sir? Hayes stopped pacing. His face calmed, which was somehow more frightening than the anger. We can't allow the Supreme Court to undermine national security in a time of crisis. We have a responsibility to protect the court, to ensure their safety and security during these dangerous times. Morrison's eyes widened. Sir, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the Supreme Court justices, particularly those who seem most hostile to necessary security measures, need to be placed under federal protection for their own safety. Mr. President, that would be seen as ensuring judicial security during a national emergency. That's all. We're just protecting them. Hayes smiled. Draft the order. Federal marshals to be stationed with each justice for their protection, effective immediately after they rule tomorrow. Sir, they'll see this as house arrest. Let them see it however they want. By the time they figure out what's happening, the crisis will be over and we can reassess. Now draft the order. Morrison left to execute the order, and Hayes returned to watching the news coverage of Elena Martinez's story. He picked up his phone, the new one since he'd smashed the other, and made a call. I need you to look into Washington Post reporter Elena Martinez. Financial records, communication logs, travel history, everything. If she's working with someone on the inside, I want to know who. He listened to the response, then. Use whatever resources are necessary. This is a national security investigation into the leak of classified information. We have broad authority. He hung up and turned off the television. Outside, protesters were gathering. They'd been gathering for days, growing larger and angrier, chanting about democracy and fascism and impeachment. Let them chant. He had work to do. At 11 p.m., Senator Middleton finished reading through Victor Chen's documentation. It was comprehensive, damning, and terrifying. Every order, every conversation, every legal memo that had been used to justify the systematic undermining of democratic processes. This is enough to impeach, Jonathan Parks said quietly. This is enough to convict, Claire corrected. This is enough to send him to prison. But we need to act fast. According to Chen, the president is planning to arrest congressional leaders. Can he actually do that? If we're not protected by the Constitution anymore, he can do anything. Claire picked up her phone. I'm calling an emergency joint session of Congress, both chambers, tomorrow morning before the Supreme Court hearing. We need to act while we still can. She spent the next hour calling members of Congress, explaining the situation, building support. By midnight, she had commitments from enough members to achieve quorum in both chambers. I truly changed the trajectory of everything that followed in my life. And sometimes, I just wish I could go back there for 5 minutes. I'd tell my younger self not to worry quite so much about what others thought. Congress would meet in secret session, would vote on immediate impeachment articles, would present a unified front against presidential overreach. By 6 a.m., President Hayes knew about it, and by 8 a.m., he'd made his decision. The arrest orders went out at 8:30 a.m. on November 9th. Federal marshals were dispatched to the homes of 17 senators and 23 House members, all of them leading voices in opposition to Hayes. The charges: conspiracy to commit sedition, attempting to overthrow the government during a national emergency, obstruction of federal authority. Most of the targeted members had anticipated something like this. They'd spent the night in secure locations, had arranged for attorneys, had prepared statements. But 3 senators were caught at home, including Senator Mike Thompson from Ohio, who'd been one of the more moderate critics. "This is insane," Thompson said as marshals placed him in handcuffs. "I'm a United States senator. You can't just arrest me for disagreeing with the president. Sir, you're being charged with sedition. You have the right to remain silent. I know my damn rights. I'm a lawyer, and this is unconstitutional. The arrest was live-streamed by Thompson's wife. Within minutes, it was everywhere. A sitting senator, in handcuffs, being led out of his home for the crime of political opposition. The Supreme Court hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 9:45 a.m., federal marshals appeared at the homes of 4 justices: Thomas Brennan, Sarah Chen, Michael Rodriguez, and Anita Williams. All 4 had been identified as likely to rule against the president. Chief Justice Brennan, the lead marshal, said, "I've been ordered to provide you with protective custody during this national emergency." Brennan, dressed in his suit and ready to leave for the court, stared at the marshal. "Protective custody." "Yes, sir. For your safety. And if I refuse this protection?" "Sir, the order comes directly from the president. I'm required to enforce it." Brennan looked at the marshal, a young man, maybe 30, clearly uncomfortable with his orders. "What's your name, Marshal?" "Thompson, sir. Marshal David Thompson." "Marshal Thompson, I need to be at the Supreme Court in 15 minutes to hear arguments in the most important case of my career. Are you going to prevent me from doing my constitutional duty?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, my orders are to keep you secure here. Your orders are unconstitutional, and if you enforce them, you'll be complicit in the overthrow of the judicial branch of government. Is that what you want to be remembered for?" "Sir, I'm just following orders," Brennan finished. "I know. That's what they all say." He stepped forward. "I'm leaving now. If you want to arrest me, arrest me. But I'm going to the court." For a long moment, Thompson didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. Brennan walked past him, got into his car, and drove to the Supreme Court. Behind him, Thompson got on his radio. "Sir, subject refused protective custody and departed. Requesting guidance." The response crackled back. "Let him go. We'll deal with it after the hearing." At 10 a.m., the Supreme Court convened. All 9 justices were present, the 4 who'd been visited by marshals, and 5 who apparently weren't considered threats. The courtroom was packed with reporters, senators who hadn't been arrested, and citizens who'd lined up overnight for seats. Chief Justice Brennan gavelled the session to order. "We are here to hear emergency petitions challenging the president's use of emergency powers to interfere with state-administered elections. This is an extraordinary session in extraordinary times. The court will hear abbreviated arguments from both sides and will issue a ruling by day's end." The next 3 hours were a masterclass in constitutional law. State attorneys general argued that the president had exceeded his authority, that his actions were pretextual, that the pattern of postponements revealed political rather than security motivations. Ed's Solicitor General, representing the president, argued broad emergency powers, historical precedent, the president's unique access to security intelligence. But even she seemed unconvinced by her own arguments. At 1 p.m., the court recessed to deliberate. At 4 p.m., they reconvened. Chief Justice Brennan read the opinion himself, his voice steady and clear. "The President of the United States has invoked emergency powers in a manner that directly interferes with state-administered federal elections. While the President possesses broad emergency authorities, those authorities are not unlimited and must be exercised in accordance with constitutional constraints. We hold that the President does not have the authority to postpone or prevent state-administered elections, regardless of claimed emergency circumstances. The states retain full authority over election administration under the Constitution. We further hold that the deployment of federal military forces to prevent lawful state election activities exceeds the President's authority under the Insurrection Act, which requires actual insurrection, rebellion, or circumstances where state authorities are unable to maintain order. Political disagreement with federal authority does not constitute insurrection. We order the immediate withdrawal of federal forces from all state election facilities, the cessation of all interference with state election processes, and the restoration of normal election procedures. States are ordered to conduct or complete elections within 30 days. This ruling is effective immediately. The president is ordered to comply within 24 hours. The courtroom erupted. Reporters ran for the exits. Senators who'd been in hiding emerged to make statements. Social media exploded, and in the White House, President Marcus Hayes watched the coverage and made a phone call. Execute the protective custody orders. All four. Brennan, Chen, Rodriguez, Williams, bring them to a secure federal facility. Immediately. Sir, his acting chief of staff said carefully, they've just ruled against you. If you arrest them now, I'm not arresting them, I'm protecting them from the chaos they've just created. Now do it. At 5 p.m., federal marshals surrounded the Supreme Court building. At 5:15 p.m., they entered and informed 4 justices they were being placed under protective custody for their own safety. At 5:30 p.m., those 4 justices were in federal vehicles, being driven to an undisclosed location. At 5:45 p.m., President Hayes addressed the nation from the Oval Office. My fellow Americans, today the Supreme Court issued a ruling that, while well-intentioned, fails to recognize the grave security threats we face. I cannot and will not comply with an order that would endanger American lives and undermine national security. As President, my oath is to protect the Constitution and the American people, and sometimes those duties conflict with judicial overreach. I have taken the difficult step of placing certain justices under protective custody to ensure their safety during these turbulent times. This is not an attack on the judiciary. This is a recognition that we live in dangerous times, and that all of us inflating Supreme Court justices need protection. I remain committed to holding free and fair elections once it is safe to do so. But I will not be bullied by courts, by Congress, or by anyone else into taking actions that endanger this nation. Thank you, and may God bless America. The Rubicon had been crossed. The president had defied the Supreme Court and detained its justices. There was no going back now. In Alexandria, Victor Chen watched the address and knew he'd made the right choice. In the Pentagon, General Drummond called an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs. In her Senate office, Claire Middleton began drafting articles of impeachment that would never reach a full vote. And in a holding cell in an FBI facility, Chief Justice Thomas Brennan sat in silence and wondered if this was how democracy died. Chapter 5. The Fracture. A doe. The United States military had never fractured. Not during Vietnam, when the country tore itself apart. Not during Watergate, when a president resigned in disgrace. Not even during the Civil War, when it fought itself, because then the military had split cleanly along geographical lines. But on November 10th, at 0600 hours, the fracture began. It started with the 101st Airborne Division, stationed at Fort Campbell on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Major General James Washington received orders to deploy 2 brigades to Louisville to maintain order and enforce federal authority. He read the orders 3 times, then called his brigade commanders into his office. "Gentlemen," Washington said, "I've just received deployment orders that I believe are unconstitutional. They require us to occupy an American city, to potentially use force against American civilians and state authorities, and to enforce presidential directives that the Supreme Court has explicitly ruled against. I'm refusing these orders." The room went silent. A major general refusing direct orders was career suicide at best, treason at worst. "Sir," one colonel said carefully, "can you do that?" "I can, and I'm doing it. But I'm not ordering any of you to join me." "If you want to execute these orders, You're free to take command of your units and proceed. I won't stop you, but I won't lead this division into a mission I believe violates our oath to the Constitution." Another colonel spoke up. "Sir, I'm with you. My troops are with you. If the president wants to ignore the Supreme Court, he can do it without the 101st. One by one, the brigade commanders declared their support. By 0700, the entire 101st Airborne Division was in effective rebellion against presidential authority. By 0800, General Patricia Drummond was being summoned to the White House. Drummond walked into the Oval Office to find President Hayes flanked by the Secretary of Defense, the acting Chief of Staff, and two military officers she didn't recognize, both wearing insignia of Special Operations Forces. "General," Hayes said without preamble, "Major General Washington at Fort Campbell has refused orders. I need him relieved of command immediately, and I need the 101st Airborne deployed as originally directed." "Sir, I'd like to understand the situation before taking action against a general officer." "The situation is simple. He refused orders. That's mutiny. Relieve him, court-martial him, and deploy the division." "Those are your orders?" Drummond felt the weight of 30 years of service pressing down on her. This was the moment she'd been dreading since Hayes first asked about rapid domestic deployment. "Mr. President, I need to see the orders General Washington refused." Hayes nodded to an aide who handed her a folder. Drummond read quickly. "Deployment to Louisville, enforcement of federal authority over state objections, authorization to use force if necessary." "Sir, the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that these types of deployments exceed your authority. The Supreme Court doesn't give orders to the Commander-in-Chief. With respect, sir, the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, and they've ruled that these actions are unconstitutional. And I've determined that their ruling endangers national security. My authority as president supersedes their judicial overreach." Drummond took a deep breath. "Sir, I can't execute these orders. They require the military to act in defiance of a Supreme Court ruling. That violates our oath." Hayes stood slowly. "General Drummond, are you refusing a direct order from your commander-in-chief?" "I'm declining to execute an order I believe is unconstitutional, sir, as is my duty under my oath to the Constitution." "Then you're relieved of command, effective immediately." Hayes turned to one of the special operations officers. "General Hawthorne, you're now acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Your first order is to deploy forces to Fort Campbell, relieve General Washington, and get the 101st Airborne moving." General Raymond Hawthorne was a Delta Force legend, a combat veteran who'd spent more time in war zones than in Washington. He nodded crisply. "Yes, Mr. President." Drummond stared at Hawthorne. "Ray, you can't do this. You know what this means." "I know that we follow orders, Pat. That's what soldiers do." He turned back to Hayes. "Sir, I'll need full authorization to use force if necessary. You have it. Do whatever you need to do." Drummond was escorted out of the White House by Secret Service agents. They took her phone, her credentials, and drove her to her quarters at Fort Myer. As she entered her home, she found her wife waiting. "Patricia, what happened?" "I just refused an order from the President of the United States." She collapsed into a chair. "And I just watched the military begin to split into competing factions." Senator Claire Middleton watched the news with growing horror. Reports were coming in of military units refusing orders, of generals being relieved, of conflicting chains of command. The country was hours away from military forces potentially fighting each other. "We need to go public," Jonathan Park said, "with Chen's documentation. Now, while it still matters." Claire had been debating this for 12 hours. Going public would expose Chen, would paint a target on his back, would potentially get him killed. But staying silent meant letting Hayes continue his path unchallenged. "Do it," she said. Set up a press conference. 2 hours. Senate steps. I'll be there. Jonathan made the calls while Claire reviewed the documentation one more time. It was comprehensive and damning. Memos discussing political motivations for deployment locations. Recordings of meetings where Hayes explicitly discussed using security pretexts for political goals. Legal analyses that acknowledged the constitutional questionability of the actions. But most damning of all was a memo dated October 30th, 3 days before the bridge bombing, in which Victor Chen outlined potential crisis scenarios that could justify emergency declarations and identified the Cincinnati Bridge as a vulnerable infrastructure target whose disruption would affect key electoral districts. Claire felt sick reading it. It wasn't proof that the administration had orchestrated the bombing, but it came close. It showed they'd been thinking about exactly the scenario that had unfolded days before it happened. At 3 p.m., she stood on the Senate steps with a dozen other senators and released everything. "The American people deserve to know the truth," she began, cameras recording every word. "The crisis we're experiencing is not accidental. It's not a necessary response to terrorism. It's a calculated plan to subvert democratic processes and maintain power. I'm releasing documentation provided by former White House Chief of Staff Victor Chen that shows clear evidence of planning for this crisis, of using emergency powers as political tools, of deliberately choosing deployment locations based on voting patterns rather than security needs. This documentation shows that the administration was discussing scenarios involving infrastructure attacks and emergency declarations days before the Cincinnati Bridge bombing. While we don't have proof of direct involvement in that attack, the timing and planning are suspicious enough to warrant immediate criminal investigation. But most importantly, this documentation shows that President Hayes has been systematically working to undermine constitutional governance. He has defied the Supreme Court. He has arrested members of Congress. He has deployed military forces against state authorities. He has done all of this not to protect the country, but to protect his own power. I am calling on all Americans, in the military, in federal law enforcement, in state governments, and in the streets, to resist these unconstitutional actions. History will judge us by what we do in this moment. Will we stand up for democracy, or will we let it die? The press conference lasted 90 minutes. Reporters asked hard questions. Claire answered them all, holding nothing back. The documentation was posted online in full, searchable and verifiable. By 6 p.m., it was the biggest story in the world. By 7 p.m., Victor Chen was under arrest. Chen had been home with his wife when the FBI agents arrived. He'd known it was coming, had known from the moment he gave the documentation to Middleton that there would be consequences. But knowing didn't make it easier when they handcuffed him in front of his wife. "Victor Chen, you're under arrest for violation of the Espionage Act, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and conspiracy to commit sedition." "I'm not a spy," Chen said quietly. "I'm a whistleblower. There's a difference." "Tell it to the judge, Mr. Chen." They took him not to a normal detention facility but to a black site, a CIA facility in Virginia that technically didn't exist. No lawyer, no phone call, no communication with the outside world. Just a cell, an interrogation room, and agents who wanted to know everything about who else had the documentation, who else he'd talked to, what else he knew. Chen told them nothing. Not because he was brave, he was terrified, but because he'd made a decision. He'd spent months enabling a constitutional crisis, and now he would spend whatever time necessary atoning for it. If that meant prison, even death, so be it. On the second day, they brought in a different interrogator. Older, gray-haired, who introduced himself simply as Mr. Smith. "Victor, you were a patriot once. You served your country, served your president. What happened?" "I woke up," Chen said. I realized I was serving a man who was destroying the thing I was supposed to be protecting. And you think releasing classified information was the answer? I think people deserve to know the truth. I think senators trying to do their constitutional duty deserved evidence. I think history deserved a record. History, Smith repeated. You know what history remembers? Winners. And right now, you're not winning. Maybe not, but at least I'll be able to sleep at night. Can you? Smith stared at him for a long moment, then left the room. Chen was returned to his cell, where he sat in silence and wondered if anyone even knew where he was. General Drummond knew. She'd spent the past day calling every contact she had in the intelligence community, using back channels and old friendships, until she'd located Chen. Black site detention, no legal access, no outside communication. They're holding him illegally, she told the assembled group in the secure facility. She was meeting with Claire Middleton, Elena Martinez, 3 sympathetic senators, and, surprisingly, Justice Thomas Brennan, who'd escaped custody during a medical emergency transport with the help of sympathetic marshals. Everything they're doing is illegal at this point, Justice Brennan said. The question is who's going to stop them? The military might, Drummond said, if we can unify the branches that have refused orders. I'd tell my younger self not to worry quite so much about what others thought. Notar Martinez commanding the Michigan National Guard, with Admiral Peterson of the Atlantic Fleet. They're all willing to stand up, but they need assurance that there's a legitimate command structure they can follow. Command structure? Senator Middleton asked. They need to know they're not just mutineers. They need to believe they're following lawful authority in opposition to unlawful presidential orders. That means they need Congress and the judiciary unified behind them. Justice Brennan leaned forward. What you're describing is a counter-coup. Military forces following congressional and judicial authority against presidential authority. That's never happened in American history. Neither has a president arresting Supreme Court justices, Drummond replied. We're in uncharted territory. The question is whether we're going to let Hayes write the new map or whether we're going to fight for the Constitution. Fighting might mean actual fighting, Elena Martinez said quietly. Soldier against soldier. Americans killing Americans. It might, Drummond acknowledged, but it also might not. If we can show a unified front, Congress, courts, and enough of the military, Hayes might back down. He can't govern if the entire constitutional structure opposes him. Even authoritarians need some legitimacy. What do you need from us? Claire asked. I need Congress to pass a resolution declaring the president's actions unlawful and authorizing military commanders to refuse unconstitutional orders. I need the Supreme Court to issue an injunction against further military deployment and to reaffirm yesterday's ruling. And I need all of it coordinated, simultaneous, overwhelming. When? Justice Brennan asked. Within 48 hours. Before Hayes can consolidate control. Before more military units are forced to choose sides. Before this turns into a hot war. They spent the next 4 hours planning. Congressional session in the Capitol building. Public, televised, defiant. Supreme Court hearing from a secure location. Military commanders issuing a joint statement. All timed for maximum impact. And somewhere in the planning, Elena Martinez made a call to her sources in the FBI. I need to know more about the bridge bombing. The real story. Someone knows what happened, and I need to find them. On November 12th, the protests reached a critical mass. Millions of Americans took to the streets in every major city, demanding Hayes' resignation, demanding respect for the Supreme Court, demanding democracy. In most cities, the protests were peaceful. But in several where federal forces confronted protesters, where counter-protesters clashed with demonstrators, where tensions had been building for weeks, violence erupted. In Philadelphia, a federal officer opened fire on protesters after someone threw a rock. 3 dead, dozens injured. In Phoenix, counter-protesters armed with rifles confronted protesters. 4 dead before police could restore order. In Atlanta, a building near the state capitol burned, and whether it was arson or accident was unclear. President Hayes used the violence exactly as expected. "The country is descending into chaos," he announced from the White House. "Anarchists and insurrectionists are destroying our cities. State authorities are unable or unwilling to maintain order. I have no choice but to expand federal intervention to protect American lives and property." He declared martial law in 12 cities. He federalized National Guard units in 8 states. He authorized military commanders to use lethal force to maintain order. And in doing so, he pushed the military fracture from possibility to reality. Admiral James Peterson, commanding the Atlantic Fleet, issued a statement. "The U.S. Navy will not participate in the unlawful detention of American citizens, the suppression of peaceful protest, or military action against state authorities. We serve the Constitution, not any individual president. Our ships will remain in port until lawful civilian authority is restored." General Washington at Fort Campbell echoed the sentiment. "The 101st Airborne stands ready to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. President Hayes has become a domestic enemy of the Constitution. We will not follow his orders." Within hours, 12 major military installations had declared similar positions. Not rebellion, they insisted. Loyalty to their oaths. Hayes responded by ordering loyal units to restore discipline at rebel installations. By nightfall on November 12th, there were armed standoffs at 3 military bases, federal troops facing off against federal troops, neither side willing to fire first but both prepared to fight. The United States was on the brink of civil war. In her Senate office, Claire Middleton watched the standoffs on television and felt the weight of history. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd prepared, came down to the next 48 hours. She picked up her phone and called General Drummond. "It's time. We need to move now, before shooting starts." "Agreed. I'm coordinating with military commanders. We're ready." Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. The Capitol. Congress votes to remove the president from power. Can you get enough votes? I think so. After today, after the military splits, after the violence, I think I can get enough senators and representatives who are scared enough to act. And if Hayes refuses to accept it, then the military will have to decide whether to follow a president who's been removed by constitutional process or to follow their oath to the Constitution. I'm betting on their oaths. So am I, Drummond said. God help us all. Claire hung up and looked at Jonathan. Draft the removal resolution. Clear language. No ambiguity. Marcus Hayes has violated his oath of office and is hereby removed from the presidency, effective immediately. That's not really how impeachment works. We don't have time for how it normally works. We need something now, something clear, something the military and the public can understand. Draft it. As Jonathan worked, Claire's phone rang. It was Elena Martinez. "Senator, I found someone who knows about the bombing. FBI agent who was on the investigation team. She's willing to talk, but only if I can guarantee protection." "What does she know?" "She says the bombing was domestic. Says there's evidence pointing to a fringe group with connections to people in the administration. Says the investigation was shut down before they could follow all the leads. Says she thinks it was allowed to happen, maybe even facilitated, because it served political purposes." Claire felt her blood run cold. Can she prove it? She has documentation. But Senator, if she's right, If the administration had any involvement in an attack that killed 14 Americans just to create a pretext for seizing power, this is bigger than impeachment. This is mass murder. Get her to safety. Get her documentation. We'll need it for the trials that come after. Why, after? Claire was already thinking about the trials and investigations and national healing that would be necessary once this was over, if it was ever over. She looked at the television, at the standoffs and the protests and the fracturing of America, and wondered if there was any way to put the pieces back together. Tomorrow would tell. Chapter 6. The Gambit, Epilogue, November 13th, 10 a.m. The United States Capitol. The building was surrounded by protesters, hundreds of thousands of them, filling the streets, chanting for democracy, for justice, for the removal of a president who had become a tyrant. Inside, 417 members of the House and 87 senators assembled in a joint session that would determine the fate of the nation. Senator Claire Middleton stood at the rostrum, looking out at her colleagues. Some were terrified, some were defiant, some were simply exhausted. But they were here, and that mattered. Members of Congress, she began, we are meeting today under the gravest circumstances in our nation's history. President Marcus Hayes has systematically violated his oath of office. He has defied the Supreme Court. He has deployed military forces against state authorities. He has arrested members of Congress and detained Supreme Court justices. He has turned our military against itself. He has violated every principle of constitutional governance. The Constitution provides a remedy for this situation: impeachment and removal. But traditional impeachment proceedings take time we don't have. Therefore, pursuant to Congress's authority to judge its own members and to protect the constitutional order, I am presenting a resolution declaring that President Marcus Hayes has abandoned his office through his unconstitutional actions and is hereby removed from the presidency, effective immediately. The chamber erupted. Supporters cheering, opponents shouting objections, everyone talking at once. Speaker Rodriguez gavelled for order. This isn't constitutional. Representative Crawford shouted. You can't just vote to remove a president. The Constitution gives Congress the power to check executive overreach, Claire shot back. We're exercising that power. The president has made himself a threat to constitutional governance. We're responding. The debate raged for 2 hours. Legal scholars testifying about constitutional authority. Members arguing about precedent, about process, about whether this was a brave defense of democracy or a dangerous coup attempt itself. Finally, Speaker Rodriguez called for a vote. All those in favor of the resolution to remove President Marcus Hayes from office, say aye. The ayes echoed through the chamber. All those opposed, say nay. The nays were fewer but forceful. The clerk will count the votes. The count took 15 minutes. When it was done, Speaker Rodriguez announced, the resolution passes 312 to 188 in the House, 64 to 36 in the Senate. President Marcus Hayes is hereby removed from office. The chamber erupted again, but this time the mood was different, somber, heavy. They'd just done something unprecedented in American history. Now they had to see if it would hold. In the White House, President Hayes watched the vote on television and laughed. They think they can just vote me out? He looked at his remaining advisors, those who'd stayed loyal through everything. This is insurrection. This is exactly what I've been warning about. Sir, General Hawthorne said carefully, if Congress has voted, Congress doesn't determine who's president. The Constitution does. The American people elected me. I took an oath. That doesn't end because some politicians got scared and held an illegal vote. Mr. President, his acting chief of staff said, we need to think strategically. If the military recognizes Congress's authority, The military recognizes the commander-in-chief's authority, which is me, not some emergency session of Congress acting like a revolutionary committee. Hawthorne shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I need to inform you that I've been receiving reports of units refusing to follow orders, down to the last drop of rain. It truly changed the trajectory of everything that followed in my life. And sometimes, I just wish I could go back there for 5 minutes. I'd tell my younger self not to worry quite so much about what others thought. If, Hayes interrupted, if Congress has removed me, but they haven't. They don't have that power. So I'm still president, I still give orders, and you still follow them. Understood? Hawthorne nodded slowly, but Hayes could see the doubt in his eyes. The circle was shrinking. Soon there might be no one left. His phone rang. He recognized the number, Secretary of Defense. He answered, "Yes? Mr. President, I need to inform you that I'm resigning, effective immediately. I can no longer serve an administration that has lost constitutional legitimacy." Hayes hung up without responding. Then he called the Pentagon directly, bypassing the secretary. "Get me the Joint Chiefs. Emergency conference. Now." The response came back 5 minutes later. "Sir, the Joint Chiefs are convening, but they're requesting to speak with Acting President Middleton, not." Hayes smashed the phone. Acting President Middleton. They were already recognizing her authority, already abandoning him. "Sir," one of his few remaining loyalists said quietly, "maybe we should consider." Consider what? Surrendering? Giving up? I'm the President of the United States. I don't surrender to insurrectionists. But even as he said it, Hayes could feel the power slipping away. Without the military, without the federal bureaucracy, without Congress or the courts, what was a president? Just a man in a building, giving orders no one followed. He walked to the Oval Office window and looked out at the protesters. So many of them. So angry. All because he'd tried to save the country. All because he'd done what was necessary. "Get me my lawyer," he said finally. "I need to understand my options." The rescue mission for Victor Chen was planned and executed with military precision by people who knew military precision. General Drummond coordinated with a team of Special Forces operators who'd made their choice clear. They served the Constitution, not Marcus Hayes. At 0300 on November 14th, 12 operators in 2 vehicles approached the CIA black site where Chen was being held. The facility was technically classified, but Drummond had spent 3 decades building relationships throughout the intelligence community. She knew where it was, knew its security protocols, knew which guards might be sympathetic to their cause. The team leader knocked on the facility's main entrance. When the guard answered, he found himself facing a dozen heavily armed operators. "We're here for Victor Chen," the team leader said calmly. "We're taking him into protective custody on authority of the acting president and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You can cooperate or you can get out of the way. Your choice." The guard looked at the assembled force, calculated his odds, and stepped aside. "He's in cell block C, 2nd floor. But I need you to know this is going to cause problems." Everything's a problem right now. This just happens to be one we can solve." They found Chen in his cell, disheveled and exhausted but unharmed. He looked up as the cell door opened, saw the operators, and actually smiled. "Took you long enough," he said. "Mr. Chen, we're here to take you somewhere safe. Can you walk?" "I can run if necessary." They extracted him without incident. The facility's minimal staff seemed relieved to avoid confrontation and had him in a secure location by 0400. By 0600, he was being debriefed by Senator Middleton, General Drummond, and Justice Brennan. "Tell us about the bombing." Middleton said after the preliminaries. Everything you know. Shen took a breath. This was it. The moment where he burned every bridge, destroyed any possibility of walking away with his reputation intact. But he'd made his choice. Hayes didn't order the bombing, but his people knew it was coming. The room went silent. Explain, Justice Brennan said. There was a fringe group, far-right extremists, who'd been monitored by DHS for months. They were planning something. We knew that from intelligence intercepts. In late October, there was a meeting between some of Hayes's closest advisors and intermediaries with connections to this group. I wasn't in the meeting, but I saw the aftermath. Suddenly, we were preparing emergency protocols, identifying vulnerable infrastructure, planning deployment scenarios. ARD. Are you saying the administration facilitated the attack? Middleton asked. I'm saying they knew an attack was possible, knew roughly where and when, and made sure they were prepared to exploit it. Whether they actively encouraged it or just decided not to stop it, I don't know, but they knew. The memo I dated November 2nd identifying the Cincinnati Bridge? That wasn't predictive analysis. That was based on intelligence we already had about the group's target. Can you prove this? Justice Brennan asked. I have documentation of the meetings, the intelligence reports, the timeline. I have recordings of conversations where advisors discussed allowing events to unfold that would justify emergency measures. It's not a confession, but it's enough to build a case. Elena Martinez, who'd been invited to document the conversation, was furiously taking notes. Who specifically knew? Hayes's innermost circle. 4 or 5 people. They kept it compartmentalized, but there were enough breadcrumbs that anyone looking carefully could piece it together. This is conspiracy to commit mass murder, Drummond said quietly. 14 people died. I know. Chen's voice cracked. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't act. I was too busy being useful, being indispensable. Those people are dead partly because I didn't speak up when it mattered. Middleton reached across and put a hand on his arm. You're speaking up now. That matters. Does it? Does it bring them back? Oh, but it might prevent more deaths. And it might ensure the people responsible are held accountable. They spent the next 6 hours getting Chen's full testimony on record, documented and witnessed. By afternoon, they had enough for criminal charges. By evening, the story was breaking on every news network. And in the White House, President Hayes realized that his last hope of maintaining support had just evaporated. The Supreme Court reconvened at 1800 on November 14th, this time via secure video conference from undisclosed locations. All 9 justices present, including the 4 who'd been detained and then rescued by sympathetic marshals. Chief Justice Brennan addressed the camera. The court is issuing an emergency ruling to clarify the constitutional situation. First, we reaffirm our previous ruling that President Hayes exceeded his authority in deploying military forces to interfere with state-administered elections. Second, we rule that Congress's resolution removing President Hayes from office, while unprecedented, falls within Congress's constitutional authority to protect the constitutional order when the president has become a clear and present danger to constitutional governance. Third, we order that Senator Claire Middleton, as designated by Congress, be recognized as acting president until such time as lawful elections can be conducted and a new president inaugurated. Fourth, we order all federal agencies, military forces, and government personnel to recognize and follow the lawful authority of acting President Middleton. These rulings are effective immediately. This court stands adjourned. Within an hour, the Joint Chiefs issued a statement recognizing acting President Middleton. Within 2 hours, major federal agencies, FBI, DHS, Justice, announced they would follow Supreme Court guidance. Within 3 hours, Allied nations began issuing statements recognizing Middleton's authority. And within 4 hours, President Marcus Hayes was alone in the White House with a dozen loyalists and no way forward except surrender or destruction. At 200 on November 14th, Acting President Claire Middleton addressed the nation from a secure location. She'd never expected to be in this position, had never wanted the presidency, had been content as a junior senator trying to do good work. But history had other plans. "My fellow Americans," she began, "these past weeks have tested our democracy in ways we never imagined. We've seen constitutional norms shattered, institutions threatened, and Americans pitted against each other. But we've also seen the resilience of our system, the courage of those who stood up for their oaths, and the power of citizens demanding that their government serve the people, not the powerful. President Hayes has been removed from office for grave violations of his constitutional duties. I have been designated by Congress to serve as acting president until we can conduct lawful elections. This is not the position I sought, but it is the responsibility I accept. My first action is to order the immediate withdrawal of all federal military forces from domestic law enforcement activities. State elections will be conducted under state authority, as the Constitution requires. My second action is to order the release of all individuals detained for political opposition to the former administration, including members of Congress, protesters, and whistleblowers. My third action is to request the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate all allegations of criminal conduct by the former administration, including possible involvement in the Cincinnati bridge bombing. These are difficult times, and we have difficult work ahead. We must heal our divided nation, restore faith in our institutions, and ensure that such abuses of power never happen again. But I believe in the American people. I believe in our Constitution, and I believe that we will emerge from this crisis stronger than before. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America." As the speech ended, General Drummond watched from the Pentagon and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Elena Martinez watched from her newsroom and started planning her book about these events. Victor Chen watched from his safe house and wondered if he'd ever be able to forgive himself. And in the White House, Marcus Hayes watched and realized that his presidency was over. The only question now was how it would end, with him in handcuffs or in a coffin. Tomorrow would bring the answer. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. November 15th, 0600 hours. The White House was surrounded. Not by hostile forces. This wasn't a military assault. But General Drummond had positioned units around the perimeter, a visible presence that said clearly, the armed forces of the United States now served constitutional authority, and that authority no longer resided in the building. Inside, Marcus Hayes stood in the Oval Office and stared at the resolute desk, where so many presidents before him had made history. Lincoln had sat here during the Civil War. FDR had guided the nation through Depression and World War. Kennedy had navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Hayes had tried to seize power and lost everything. General Hawthorne entered without knocking. "Mr. President," he stopped, corrected himself. "Mr. Hayes, we need to talk." About what? My surrender? My arrest? My humiliation? "About reality, sir. We have perhaps 24 people left in this building. The military has recognized Acting President Middleton. Federal agencies have recognized her. The Supreme Court has confirmed her authority. We have no power, no support, and no way forward. We have the presidency. I was elected. None. You were removed. Whether we agree with the process or not, it's been done. Congress voted. The court affirmed it. The military has made its choice. Continuing to resist just means people die for nothing." Hayes turned to face him. "You're my last general, Ray. Everyone else abandoned me. Are you abandoning me too?" Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. Sir, I followed you because I believe in strong leadership, because I thought you were trying to protect the country. But I've seen what's happened these past weeks. I've seen the Constitution ignored, the courts defied, Americans turned against each other. That's not protection. That's destruction. So you're leaving. I'm advising you to accept reality. Senator Middleton, Acting President Middleton, has sent word that she's willing to negotiate a peaceful resolution. She's offering terms. Arms, Hayes repeated bitterly. The President of the United States doesn't negotiate terms with insurrectionists. Arn, you're not the President anymore. And they're not insurrectionists. They're the legitimate constitutional government, and we're the ones occupying federal property without authority. Hawthorne moved to the window. Sir, I've spent my career in combat. I know what happens when people decide to fight to the death. It's ugly, it's pointless, and it never ends the way anyone wants. Please don't make this a fight. There's been too much damage already. Hayes sat down heavily in the presidential chair. He looked old, defeated, nothing like the confident figure who'd promised to make America great again. What are the terms? You surrender peacefully. You submit to arrest. You cooperate with investigation. In exchange, they guarantee your safety, legal representation, and a fair trial. A trial where I'll be convicted of treason and spend the rest of my life in prison. Maybe. But at least you'll be alive. At least no one else has to die for this. Hayes was silent for 5 minutes. Hawthorne waited, knowing this was the most important negotiation of his career and that he had no leverage except reason. Finally, Hayes spoke. Set up the meeting. I'll talk to Middleton. Claire Middleton stood in the situation room of an undisclosed government facility, surrounded by advisors, generals, and Justice Brennan. She'd been acting president for less than 24 hours, and she was already negotiating the surrender of her predecessor. He's agreed to talk, General Drummond said, hanging up her secure line. But he wants certain assurances. Level. What kind of assurances? Loyalty for his immediate family. Legal representation of his choice. No immediate media circus. The man's terrified, acting president. He knows what comes next. Claire nodded. Granted. All of it. I don't want him to feel trapped. I want him to see that there's a way forward that doesn't involve bloodshed. You're being generous to a man who tried to become a dictator, one advisor said. I'm being strategic, Claire corrected. If he goes down fighting, people die. If he believes he'll get a fair trial, he might surrender. And regardless of what he did, he deserves due process. That's what separates us from him. Justice Brennan spoke up. Where do you want to meet him? Here. Neutral ground. He can bring Hawthorne and 2 others. We'll have equivalent numbers. No weapons, no theatrics. Just a conversation between Americans trying to find a way forward. The meeting was set for 1,000 hours. Claire spent the intervening time on phone calls, reassuring allies, coordinating with Congress, beginning the massive task of restoring normal governmental functions. She also called her mother, who'd been watching everything on television in Richmond. Mom? I'm okay. Claire Elizabeth Middleton, you're President of the United States and you're negotiating with a man who had Supreme Court justices arrested. That is not okay. Acting President. And yes, you're right. But someone has to do it. I'm proud of you, sweetie. Your father would be proud too. Her father had been a career military officer, a colonel who died in Iraq when Claire was in college. He'd taught her about duty, honor, and service, lessons that had shaped everything she'd become. Thanks, Mom. I have to go. I have a country to save. Just don't forget to eat something. History's important, but so is lunch. Claire smiled despite everything. Yes, ma'am. Marcus Hayes arrived at 1,000 hours exactly. flanked by General Hawthorne and his personal attorney. He looked diminished somehow, as if losing the presidency had physically shrunk him. Claire stood to greet him. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming." Did I have a choice?" His voice was bitter but not aggressive. Defeated. "There's always a choice. Please, sit." They sat across from each other at a conference table. Justice Brennan and General Drummond flanked Claire. Hayes's lawyer and Hawthorne flanked him. The room felt like a courtroom, which was fitting given what they were there to negotiate. "Let me be direct," Claire began. "The constitutional crisis you created is over. You've been removed from office through a legitimate constitutional process. The military, the courts, and Congress recognize my authority as acting president. Your options now are to surrender peacefully or to force us to take you by force. I'm hoping you'll choose peace." Hayes stared at her. "You're asking me to surrender, to admit I was wrong, to go quietly to prison. I'm asking you to accept reality and to spare the nation further trauma. Yes, you'll face trial. Yes, you'll likely be convicted, but you'll have due process, legal representation, the chance to make your case. That's more than dictators usually get." "I'm not a dictator. I was trying to save the country." "You were trying to save your power," Justice Brennan said quietly. "And in doing so, you nearly destroyed the country you claimed to love." Hayes turned to look at him. "You people never understood what I was up against. The media lying about me every day, the deep state working to undermine me, the forces aligned against everything I was trying to do." "The only force you were up against," Claire interrupted, "was the Constitution. Everything you encountered, criticism, opposition, checks and balances, that was democracy working. And rather than accept it, you tried to destroy it. I suspended some elections for security reasons. You manipulated a crisis to maintain power. We have documentation. We have Victor Chen's testimony. We have evidence suggesting your administration knew about the bridge bombing and allowed it to happen. You don't get to pretend this was noble." Hayes slumped in his chair. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to sign a statement acknowledging that you've been removed from office and accepting the authority of this government. I want you to order anyone still loyal to you to stand down. And I want you to submit to arrest and cooperate with investigations. And if I refuse?" Claire leaned forward. "Then federal marshals will enter the White House and arrest you by force. It might get ugly. People might get hurt. You'll still end up in custody, but the nation will have to watch a former president dragged out of the White House in handcuffs. Is that really how you want this to end?" Hayes looked at Hawthorne, who nodded slightly. Then at his lawyer, who nodded as well. Then back at Claire. "I want certain conditions," he said. "I'm listening. My family stays out of this. They're not charged, they're not harassed, they're left alone. Unless they were directly involved in criminal activity," agreed. "I want a civilian lawyer, not a public defender. Someone good. You can afford your own lawyer." "Granted." "And I want the trials to be public. I want Americans to hear my side, to understand what I was trying to do." Claire exchanged glances with Justice Brennan. "The trials will be public, subject to normal rules about classified information. You'll have your chance to testify, to make your case. Whether Americans believe you is up to them, but you'll get your say." Hayes was silent for a long moment. Outside the room, Claire could hear the bustle of government continuing. Phones ringing, people talking, the machinery of democracy grinding forward. "All right," Hayes said finally. "I'll surrender. But I want it on record that I believe this entire process is unconstitutional and that history will vindicate me." Noted. "For what it's worth, history will judge all of us. I hope it's kinder to you than I think it will be." The paperwork took an hour. Hayes signed statements, gave orders to his remaining loyalists, made phone calls to family members. At 11:30, he stood up and looked at Claire. "So what happens now?" "Now federal marshals escort you to a detention facility. You'll be arraigned on charges, assigned counsel if you haven't retained one, and held pending trial. The system works, Mr. Hayes. Even for you, a system I tried to overthrow." "Yes, which makes it all the more important that we prove it works." On November 15th, federal marshals placed Marcus Hayes under arrest. The charges were read: abuse of power, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, and, pending investigation, potential conspiracy related to the Cincinnati bridge bombing. Hayes said nothing as they let him out. No dramatic last words, no angry outbursts. He just walked, flanked by marshals, no longer president, no longer powerful, just a man who'd bet everything on becoming a dictator and lost. General Drummond watched from a distance and felt a complex mix of relief, sadness, and exhaustion. This was what success looked like: a former president in handcuffs, a nation traumatized but intact, a constitution tested but surviving. Elena Martinez was there too, documenting everything for history. She'd been covering this story for weeks, had helped expose the truth, had played her small part in defending democracy. As Hayes passed, he looked at her once, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been regret, or might have been rage. She'd probably never know. Victor Chen watched on television from his safe house and felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift. He'd enabled this crisis, but he'd also helped end it. That didn't balance the scales, didn't erase his guilt, but it was something. And Claire Middleton, now acting president in fact as well as title, returned to the Situation Room and began the enormous task of rebuilding. She had Congress to work with, federal agencies to restore, allies to reassure, and a nation to heal. But at least the immediate crisis was over. At least no more Americans had died. At least democracy had survived. For now, that would have to be enough. That evening, Acting President Middleton addressed the nation again, this time from the Oval Office, the same office Hayes had occupied that morning, now stripped of his personal touches and being returned to neutral ground. "My fellow Americans, President Hayes has surrendered and is in custody. He will face trial for his actions. Justice will be served. But our work is just beginning. We need to understand how we got here, how safeguards failed, how one person could come so close to overthrowing our constitutional system. We need reforms, stronger checks on emergency powers, clearer lines of authority, better protections against executive overreach. We also need to heal. This crisis has divided us, has set Americans against each other, has eroded trust in institutions that must function for democracy to survive. Healing won't be quick or easy, but it's necessary. I'm announcing the formation of a bipartisan commission to investigate the crisis and recommend reforms. I'm requesting Congress to establish clear limits on presidential emergency powers. And I'm calling on all Americans to remember that we are one nation, indivisible, and that our strength comes from our unity, not our divisions. We've been through a terrible test, but we've passed it. Our Constitution proved strong enough, our institutions resilient enough, and our people determined enough to defend democracy when it was threatened. Now we must ensure it never happens again. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. As the speech ended, Claire sat back in the presidential chair and allowed herself one moment of relief. They'd done it. Against all odds, against a president willing to shred the Constitution, against the fracturing of government itself, they'd held the line. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new tests. That was the nature of democracy. It was never finished, never secure, always requiring vigilance and courage. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same view Hayes had looked at that morning. The protesters were still there, but now they were celebrating. Singing, cheering, waving flags. Democracy had survived. For now. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. 6 weeks later, December 28th. The courtroom was packed for Marcus Hayes's arraignment. Former presidents usually disappeared quietly into retirement, writing memoirs and building libraries. But Hayes would spend his post-presidency in a very different kind of building. He stood before Judge Maria Santos in an orange jumpsuit. They denied bail, citing him as a flight risk, and listened as the charges were read. 23 federal counts including abuse of power, conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, obstruction of justice, and 3 counts of felony murder related to deaths resulting from the bridge bombing. The last charges were the most serious. Victor Chen's testimony and corroborating documentation had proven that Hayes's inner circle knew about the planned attack, had sufficient warning to prevent it, and chose instead to let it happen because it served their political needs. 14 people had died in that bombing. The law said anyone who caused a death during the commission of a felony could be charged with murder. "How do you plead?" Judge Santos asked. Hayes's attorney stood. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor." "Very well. Trial is set for March 15th. The defendant will remain in custody. We're adjourned." As marshals led Hayes away, Elena Martinez watched from the press gallery and typed notes for her book. The trial of Marcus Hayes would be published in 2 years, would win the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction, and would become required reading in every political science classroom in America. But that was future. Right now, she was just trying to document history as it happened. The special elections were held on January 15th, exactly 2 months after the crisis had begun. Acting President Middleton had insisted on holding them as soon as possible, partly to restore legitimacy, partly to prevent anyone from claiming she was clinging to power. The elections were held under unusual circumstances. Military units provided security, but only at the request of state authorities and without interfering in election administration. International observers monitored polling places. Media coverage was intense and mostly fair. Voter turnout was the highest in a midterm election in American history. People who'd never voted before stood in line for hours, many carrying signs that read, "Never again," or "Democracy matters," or simply, "I voted." When the results came in, Democrats had gained significant ground, not surprising given that the crisis had been precipitated by a Republican president. But Republicans who'd stood up against Hayes, who'd voted for his removal, mostly held their seats. The message was clear. Americans rewarded courage and integrity, regardless of party. Acting President Middleton gave a victory speech despite not being on any ballot. These elections proved that democracy works. When tested, Americans chose freedom. When threatened, Americans chose courage. When given the choice between easy authoritarianism and difficult democracy, Americans chose democracy. This is who we are. This is who we will always be. Claire had been approached by party leaders about running for president in the upcoming election. She had name recognition, national stature, a compelling story. She could win. But she'd surprised everyone by declining. "I became acting president because the Constitution demanded it, not because I wanted power. I've done what needed to be done. Now I'm going back to the Senate, where I can do the most good." Privately, she told Jonathan Park the real reason. "I've seen what the presidency does to people. I've seen what proximity to that much power can corrupt. I want to serve, not to rule. The Senate is where I belong." The Democratic Party selected a different nominee for the presidential race. Claire supported her wholeheartedly, and then focused on her Senate work, the Commission on Executive Power Reform, the investigations into the crisis, the work of national healing. General Patricia Drummond testified before a joint session of Congress in early February. The Armed Services Committees wanted to understand what had happened within the military, how the crisis had been navigated, what lessons could be learned. She sat in full-dress uniform, her chest covered in ribbons earned over 30 years of service, and told the truth. "I want to be clear about something," she began. "I refused unlawful orders, but I struggled with that decision. I agonized over it, because I'd spent my entire career following orders, respecting the chain of command, maintaining military discipline. Going against a direct order from the commander-in-chief went against everything I'd been trained to do. But my oath is to the Constitution, not to any individual. And when I saw orders that violated that Constitution, I had to choose. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary." The military performed remarkably well during this crisis, considering the impossible situation we were put in. Most units acted professionally. Most commanders prioritized their constitutional oath. Most soldiers remained loyal to their principles rather than to personalities. But we got lucky. We could easily have had bloodshed on a massive scale. We could have had military units fighting each other. We could have had a full civil war. The fact that we didn't is testament to the character and judgment of individual service members, not to any systemic safeguards. So my recommendation is this: we need clearer guidelines for when military officers can and should refuse orders. We need better education on constitutional obligation. We need to prepare the military for the possibility of having to choose between a president and the Constitution, because we've now proven that possibility is real. And most importantly, we need civilians to understand that asking the military to save democracy from a rogue president is asking too much. The military should never be the final check on executive power. That's Congress's job. That's the court's job. That's the people's job. The military should be the absolute last resort, and the fact that we came so close to needing it should terrify every American. The testimony was powerful, unflinching, and uncomfortable. It forced Congress to confront how close they'd come to complete failure. It sparked reforms, new legislation on military obligations, clearer guidance on lawful orders, better training on constitutional duties. And it established Drummond as a national figure, someone who'd put principle over career and survived. She was promoted to a 4-star billet and continued her service, but she also became a voice for military professionalism and constitutional integrity. Victor Chen spent the weeks after the crisis in a strange limbo. He was simultaneously a hero, the whistleblower who'd helped expose presidential crimes, and a villain, the enabler who'd helped plan the constitutional crisis in the first place. He testified in multiple investigations. He provided documentation. He explained over and over how seemingly reasonable steps had led to catastrophe, how small compromises had accumulated into betrayal. "I thought I was being pragmatic," he told the commission investigating the crisis. "I thought I was helping the president navigate complex situations. I told myself that as long as I kept everything technically legal, as long as I didn't explicitly cross lines, I was doing my job. But I was wrong. Being technically legal isn't enough when you're helping someone destroy democracy." The commission's report would cite his testimony extensively. It would become a case study in how good people can enable bad outcomes through small compromises and incremental normalizations of the abnormal. Chen's wife stood by him, which surprised him every day. "You made mistakes," she told him, "but you also fixed them. That counts for something, years." He was never charged with crimes. Prosecutors determined he'd been following orders and had ultimately blown the whistle, but he'd never work in government again. Instead, he became a consultant, helping organizations understand how normal institutional processes can fail, how to recognize warning signs of authoritarian drift, how to maintain integrity under pressure. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was the career he'd earned. The Commission on Executive Power Reform released its report in April. It was comprehensive, unflinching, and deeply critical of institutional failures at every level. Key recommendations included: Mori. Stricter limits on presidential emergency powers, with automatic congressional review and sunset provisions, clear criteria for when the Insurrection Act can be invoked, with judicial review required, better whistleblower protections for federal employees, strengthened independence for inspectors general and ethics officials, new protocols for military officers facing potentially unconstitutional orders, electoral reforms to prevent future attempts at election manipulation, enhanced congressional oversight of executive actions, limits on presidential pardon power in cases involving the president's associates. Congress passed most of the recommendations into law. Some were challenged in court, but the Supreme Court, now operating normally again, generally upheld them, recognizing that the crisis had exposed genuine constitutional vulnerabilities. Acting President Middleton signed the reforms into law at a ceremony attended by hundreds of people who'd played roles in surviving the crisis: military commanders, congressional leaders, state officials, journalists, whistleblowers, ordinary citizens who'd protested and resisted. These reforms are necessary, Middleton said at the signing, but they're not sufficient. Laws and rules can't protect democracy if citizens aren't willing to defend it. What saved us wasn't just our Constitution, as brilliant as that document is. What saved us was people choosing to honor their oaths, choosing to stand up, choosing to risk everything for principles they believed in. That choice will always be necessary. Democracy isn't a machine that runs on autopilot. It's a garden that requires constant tending. The moment we forget that, the moment we assume it will survive without effort, is the moment we start losing it. On your later. November 8th. Elena Martinez stood at the site of the Cincinnati Bridge, now rebuilt and operating. There was a memorial here, a simple stone monument listing the 14 names of people who died in the bombing. She'd visited it many times while researching her book, had interviewed the families, had tried to understand what their losses meant. They died for nothing, one widow had told her. Their deaths were engineered, allowed, exploited for politics, for power. That's what makes it so hard to bear. Elena had included those words in her book. She'd also included profiles of each victim, who they were, what they'd been doing that morning, what they'd left behind. She'd been determined that they not be forgotten, not be reduced to statistics, not be overlooked in the larger story of constitutional crisis. Her book had been published to critical acclaim. It had sold millions of copies. It had been optioned for a limited series. But what mattered most to Elena was that it told the truth, all of it, without simplification or partisan spin. She'd been criticized by some for being too harsh on Hayes, by others for not being harsh enough. Hayes's supporters claimed she was biased against him. Hayes's opponents claimed she gave him too much credit for his motivations. She'd taken all the criticism as a sign she'd gotten it right. When everyone is slightly unhappy with you, you're probably being fair. Now she was working on her next project, a documentary about the crisis, featuring interviews with all the major players except Hayes himself, who'd refused from prison. She hoped it would be ready for the 2-year anniversary. General Drummond retired from the military in June of the following year, after 31 years of service. Her retirement ceremony was attended by every member of the Joint Chiefs, 3 former Secretaries of Defense, and Acting President Middleton herself. General Drummond represents the best of military service, Middleton said in her remarks. She showed that following orders and following your conscience aren't always the same thing. She showed that loyalty to an oath can require disloyalty to a person. She showed courage when courage was in short supply. The nation owes her an enormous debt, Drummond's own speech was shorter. "I just did my job." Lots of people did their jobs during those terrible weeks. That's what saw us through, not heroes, just people doing their jobs according to their oaths. That's what makes democracy work. She and her wife retired to a house on the Virginia coast. She wrote a memoir, less about herself and more about military ethics and constitutional obligations that became required reading at West Point and every other service academy. And she occasionally spoke at universities and public forums, always making the same point. Democracy is fragile. It requires constant vigilance, and it requires people willing to stand up when standing up costs something. Don't assume someone else will do it. Don't assume it can't happen here. Eternal vigilance isn't just a saying. It's the price we pay for freedom. Marcus Hayes' trial began in March and lasted 4 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Documentation, testimony, recordings, a paper trail that showed systematic abuse of power. Hayes testified in his own defense, spending 3 days on the stand explaining his actions. He maintained that everything he'd done was legal under emergency powers, that he'd been trying to protect the country, that his opponents had been the real threat to democracy. The jury didn't believe him. On June 15th, they found him guilty on 21 of 23 counts. The felony murder charges were dismissed. Prosecutors couldn't prove Hayes personally knew about the bombing in advance, but the abuse of power and conspiracy charges stuck. Judge Santos sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. He'd be eligible for parole in 17 years, at which point he'd be 84 years old. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said at sentencing, "you held the highest office in the land. You swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. You broke that oath. You abused your powers. You nearly destroyed the very system you claimed to defend. Your crimes were not crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated, planned, executed with full knowledge of what you were doing. You chose power over principle, repeatedly and deliberately. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison. I hope you use that time to reflect on the damage you caused and the trust you betrayed. This court stands adjourned." Hayes showed no emotion as he was led away. He filed appeals, would file appeals for years, but they would all fail. The evidence was too strong, the verdict too sound, the message too important to undermine. 2 years later, November 8th anniversary, the nation held a day of remembrance on the 2-year anniversary of the crisis. Services were held at the Bridge Memorial, speeches were given in Washington, schools taught lessons about the fragility of democracy and the importance of active citizens. Claire Middleton, now back in the Senate and chair of the Judiciary Committee, gave a speech at the National Archives, standing before the Constitution itself. 2 years ago, we came within hours of losing everything this document represents, not because of foreign enemies or natural disasters, but because of choices made by Americans. One man who chose power over principle, and too many others who chose comfort over courage. But we also saw Americans make better choices. Military officers who chose their oaths over their orders. Journalists who chose truth over access. Citizens who chose to stand up when standing up was dangerous. Government workers who blew the whistle even knowing the cost. These people saved democracy. The question for all of us is, what choice will we make when tested? Because we will be tested again. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not as dramatically, but democracy is always being tested. And it only survives when enough people choose to defend it. So today, I ask you to make that choice. Choose to stay informed. Choose to vote. Choose to speak up when you see wrong. Choose to put principle over party, truth over tribalism, country over personal benefit. Choose to be the kind of citizen democracy requires. Because in the end, Democracy isn't about buildings or documents or systems. It's about choices. Millions of small choices made every day by ordinary people. Those choices are what make us free. Don't forget that. Don't take it for granted. Don't assume someone else will make the hard choices so you don't have to. Democracy is a gift, but it's also a responsibility. Let's honor both. Victor Chen watched the anniversary coverage from his home office, where he was working on a paper about organizational failures and ethical drift. His wife was in the kitchen, making dinner. His kids were doing homework upstairs. Life had achieved a kind of normalcy he hadn't thought possible 2 years ago. He still struggled with guilt. He still had nightmares about the bridge, about the deaths, about his role in enabling the crisis. His therapist said that was healthy. It meant his conscience was functioning, that he understood the weight of his actions. But he'd also found purpose in his work. He consulted with governments, corporations, nonprofits, helping them understand how good systems could fail, how good people could make bad choices, how to recognize and resist authoritarian drift. It's never sudden, he told audiences. No one wakes up one day and decides to overthrow democracy. It happens incrementally. Small compromises, small normalizations, small rationalizations, until one day you look around and realize you've helped build something monstrous. The key is catching it early, refusing the first compromise, speaking up at the first warning sign. That's what I failed to do. That's what I'm trying to help others not fail at. Not for born. As the sun set on the anniversary, acting President Middleton, still acting, the special presidential election would be held the following month, sat in the Oval Office and reflected on the past 2 years. The crisis had changed her. She'd discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed, learned lessons about leadership and courage and the weight of history. She'd also learned that power was seductive, that the presidency could corrupt even people with good intentions, that giving up power was harder than gaining it. That's why she'd refused to run for a full term. She'd done what needed to be done, had helped the nation heal, had overseen reforms and investigations. But she'd seen what Hayes had become, had felt the pull of presidential power herself, had recognized that staying too long could change her into something she didn't want to be. So she'd step down after the election, return to the Senate, continue her work without the temptations and pressures of executive authority. Jonathan Park had called her crazy. You could be president for 8 years. You could accomplish so much. I've accomplished what I needed to accomplish, she'd replied. The rest is up to the person we elect, not the person we appointed. Now, sitting in the office where so much history had been made, she wrote a final memo to her successor. It was simple. The presidency is the most powerful position in the world. It's also the most dangerous to democracy, dangerous to the Constitution, dangerous to your own soul. Use the power wisely. Respect the limits. Remember you serve the people, not yourself. And when your time is done, walk away. The greatest service a president can give is knowing when to leave. Good luck. The republic depends on you, but it also depends on you not thinking you're indispensable. None of us are. She sealed the memo and placed it in the desk drawer where her successor would find it on Inauguration Day. Then she turned off the lights and walked out of the Oval Office, ready to return to being just a senator, just a citizen. Just another person trying to do good work in a democracy that would always need defending. Epilogue, Elena Martinez's documentary, premiered on November 8th, 3 years after the crisis. It was watched by 47 million people on its first night, making it the most-watched documentary in history. The final scene showed all the major players: Claire Middleton, Pat Drummond, Victor Chen, Thomas Brennan, gathered at the Bridge Memorial, laying flowers for the 14 victims whose deaths had started everything. What did we learn? Elena asked them on camera. Drummond answered first. We learned that institutions matter, but people matter more. The Constitution is only as strong as the people willing to defend it, Brennan said. We learned that no one is coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. Courts can rule, but someone has to enforce those rulings. Laws can exist, but someone has to follow them. Democracy is a choice we make every day, Chen said. We learned that complicity is easy and courage is hard. I chose complicity for too long. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to atone for that, Claire said. We learned that democracy is fragile, that it can fail, that it nearly did fail. But we also learned that it's resilient, that it can survive, that it's worth fighting for. The question is whether we'll remember these lessons the next time we're tested. Will we be tested again? Elena asked. Absolutely, Claire said. Democracy is always being tested. The only question is whether we'll pass. The documentary ended with footage of the next generation. Students learning about the crisis, young people registering to vote, teenagers discussing the importance of active citizenship. The message was clear. The crisis had been survived, but the work was never finished. Democracy required eternal vigilance. And as long as people were willing to be vigilant, it would survive. Marcus Hayes watched the documentary from his prison cell. He'd been allowed a television, had watched the anniversary coverage, had seen himself portrayed as a villain in America's near-death experience. He still believed he'd been right. Still believed he'd been trying to save the country. Still believed that history would vindicate him someday. But sitting in his cell, alone with his thoughts, he sometimes wondered. Not about his intentions, those had been good, he was sure, but about his methods. About the line between protecting democracy and destroying it. About whether he'd become the very thing he'd claimed to be fighting against. He'd probably never admit it out loud. Probably never apologize. Probably take his version of the truth to his grave. But in quiet moments, in the dark hours of the night, Marcus Hayes wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. And in those moments, he felt something that might have been regret. Or might have just been the weight of time pressing down on a man who'd reached for power and found only emptiness. The Warning. A political thriller when President Marcus Hayes faces devastating polling data 3 weeks before midterm elections. He begins exploring extraordinary measures to maintain power. After a suspicious bridge bombing creates the perfect crisis, Hayes declares a national emergency, deploys federal troops to swing states, and postpones elections in key Democratic precincts. What follows is a harrowing descent into constitutional crisis as Hayes defies the Supreme Court, arrests congressional opponents, and pushes America to the brink of civil war. Standing against him are Senator Claire Middleton, who leads congressional resistance, General Patricia Drummond, who must choose between orders and her oath, Victor Chen, Hayes's chief of staff turned whistleblower, and journalist Elena Martinez, who exposes the truth about the bombing. As the military fractures and armed standoffs develop across the country, the nation faces questions it never thought it would confront. Can a president become a dictator? Will the military follow unconstitutional orders? What happens when all three branches of government are in conflict? Based on real presidential powers and constitutional constraints, The Warning is a chilling exploration of how democracy can fail and how ordinary people with extraordinary courage can save it. It's a story about the fragility of democratic norms, the importance of institutional integrity, and the eternal price of freedom, vigilance. In the end, Hayes is removed from office and faces criminal trial, but not before bringing America closer to civil war than at any time since 1865. The novel concludes with hard-won reforms and a sobering reminder: democracy survived this test, but it will be tested again. The question is whether Americans will remember the lessons when the next crisis comes. Authors note this novel is entirely fictional and set in an alternative universe. While it draws on real constitutional powers, historical precedents, and political dynamics, all characters and events are products of imagination. The purpose is not to predict the future or vilify any real individuals, but to explore the stress tests that democratic institutions might face and the importance of citizens, officials, and military personnel who honor their oaths to the Constitution above personal or political loyalties.